When China was brought into the global economy, integrated into the global economy, there in that phase was consolidation. बाद में आया competition and now it's going to be conflict. पंडित नेहरू ने जनरल थोराट तब रिटायर हो चुके थे, उनको बुलाया गया, उनको कहा कि ये रिपोर्ट आपने लिखी थी 1959-60 में that India is not prepared to go to war with China and yet we did, but I have not seen the report. General Thorat told him, this question, Mr. Prime Minister, you should be asking your former defense minister.
Yo, what is up my friends? Welcome to another episode of Dostcast. मेरा नाम है विनम्र कसाना. अगर आप इस चैनल पे पहली बार आए हैं, consider subscribing because we release new episodes every Tuesday and Friday at 12 PM Indian Standard Time. आज के हमारे गेस्ट का नाम है प्रोबल दासगुप्ता, जिन्होंने ये किताब लिखी है Watershed 1967 India's Forgotten Victory over China. शेखर गुप्ता जी कहते हैं थ्रिलर है और अर्जुन सुब्रमण्यम कहते हैं अ गिफ्टेड स्टोरी टेलर. मैं तो टेस्टिमोनियल पढ़ रहा हूँ, बट आज की कॉन्वर्सेशन इज़ प्रॉब्ली द मोस्ट इमर्सिव कॉन्वर्सेशन ऑन इंडिया चाइना की जियोपॉलिटिक्स. चाइना के अंदर जिनपिंग का क्या दबाव है, क्या दबदबा है उसका. इंडिया एक ऐसा वॉर है जो आप जानते नहीं होगे, जो चाइना के खिलाफ जीती थी. एक वॉर वो हारी थी, लेकिन 1967 में एक्चुअली इंडिया ने चाइना को हरा दिया था. Currently, Probal is a senior corporate advisor and a frequent columnist on the First Post website. सबसे क्रेजी और हैरानी की बात यह है कि Probal has served as the major company commander of 11 Gorkha rifles. आप गोरखा के बारे में बहुत कुछ जानते हो. इस पूरी कॉन्वर्सेशन के अंदर I have not met a man like Probal where his ideas about Chinese surveillance, India की military might क्या है, what is the comparison between a Chinese soldier versus an Indian military guy, all of that. This extremely immersive conversation done in both Hindi and English for 2 hours is going to blow your mind. The episode with author, columnist, senior corporate advisor and former army man Probal Dasgupta begins in 3, 2, 1. I have never heard the word asymmetric warfare उससे पहले and corporate espionage. These are cool terms. I've heard the latter of these terms, warfare, espionage. But आपका जो article था First Post पे, you were talking about how China has been using balloons to, and probably even sending their citizens to acquire soft power in universities and US institutions so that they maybe understand the ways of the West, something like that. I was just wondering, where have these terms originated and why did you decide to write about that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Vinamre. One of the things that I have always maintained is that China explores a lot of the global space through building narratives. And ये जो narrative building है, यहाँ से जो दूसरे टूल्स हैं वो उभर के आती हैं, जैसे एस्पियोनाज का हो गया, या किसी को आप बाहर भेज रहे हो टू गेट इंफॉर्मेशन थ्रू वेरियस मीन्स. नाउ व्हेन आई से नैरेटिव बिल्डिंग, चाइना स्पेंड्स 10 बिलियन अ ईयर ऑन बिल्डिंग नैरेटिव्स अक्रॉस द वर्ल्ड. एंड व्हाट डज दैट मीन? अभी इसमें ये है कि हम जैसे एस्पियोनाज को समझते हैं कि कोई गया बाहर, कहीं इंफॉर्मेशन बाय स्टेल्थ लाया, वो तो एक तरीका हो गया. दूसरा ये है कि यू कैन ऑलवेज बिल्ड अ नैरेटिव थ्रू पॉलिटिशियंस, थ्रू स्टूडेंट्स, जैसे आपने कहा, एंड इट कैन बी थ्रू मीडिया और थ्रू वेरियस मीन्स वेयर इन पीपल बाय इन टू एन ऑर्गेनिक अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ चाइनाज गोल्स विदाउट रियली, it's not coming from China, it's coming from the local media or columnists or academics, etc. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, an Australian MP was charged with taking money from China to pass on secrets to the Chinese government and also argue China's cause in the international forum. Now, we also know कि ऑस्ट्रेलिया और चाइना के बीच में काफ़ी मतभेद हुई हैं, हाल में हुई हैं, पहले भी हुई हैं, लेकिन ये जो लोकल एडवोकेट को यूज़ करना अपने कॉज के बारे में बताने के लिए, ये नैरेटिव बिल्डिंग चाइना का देखा गया है अभी और पहले भी. 1961 में मैंने एक पीस में मैंने लिखा भी है, 1961 में फ्रांस के बाद में प्रेसिडेंट बने फ्रांसवा मित्रान, जब वो चाइना गए 1961 में, उस वक्त जो है माओ का रेपुटेशन ऐसा था कि एवरीबडी वाज टॉकिंग अबाउट कि कितने वहाँ पे डेथ्स हुए थे, मिलियन डेथ्स, एंड अल्टीमेटली इट बिकेम द नंबर वाज 45 million deaths between 1958 and 1962. You see a lot of Hollywood films made on the Germans and how Hitler exterminated the Jews in those 5 or 6 years of 1939 to 1945. Nobody talks about 1958 to 1962 and beyond. 45 million is an official figure. The numbers are far more. Now 45 million जो वहाँ पे ख़त्म हुए उस दौरान, अभी फ्रांसवा मित्रों जी जाते हैं, वापस आते हैं, and he tells the world that China through its food programs has eliminated famine, which was directly opposite to what was happening in China. What happened was he was taken around various cities and he was shown that, all is okay, don't worry. This is when we say espionage, it's also part of the larger narrative building. Embedding people with information that they go out and speak on your behalf, which they were doing. Now, this is one form. You spoke about the Chinese balloon. Yes. Now that is something that has existed, that kind of a thing, using people, using devices. Now you suddenly see balloons everywhere. अभी जापान के ऊपर भी balloon है, इंडिया के ऊपर भी airships है, drones हैं, use of AI. These are all electronic or automated means or technology supported means of gathering intelligence. लेकिन जैसे पहले सोवियट्स करते थे, अभी चाइना करती हैं कि एक तो ऑटोमेटेड डिवाइस या टेक्नोलॉजी के द्वारा माध्यम से इंटेलिजेंस गैदर करना, दूसरा टू मेक योर ओन पीपल यूजफुल, बिकॉज earlier we would hear about the Soviet spies in UK, in US. China has been doing that. China has flown under the radar. What has also happened is that, पहले क्या होता था, Soviet से US was always wary. So it used to keep them at a distance. KGB, we know about KGB, we know what KGB did this, KGB did that. MI6 ने UK में ऐसा किया, counter intelligence वैसा हुआ, but you don't hear about the Chinese intelligence. And one of the best things about espionage, one of the most effective things is when you do it without people talking about it. In 1986, and this is as far as back as 1986, when China was not even a global power, CIA में जो ट्रांसलेटर था आपका, जो मैंडरिन का ट्रांसलेटर था, वो 30 साल से वहाँ पे काम करता था, और वो 30 साल से वहाँ की जो कॉन्वर्सेशंस हैं, जो CIA में जो अमेरिकन प्लान्स थे, वो अमेरिकी प्लान्स वो चाइना को दे रहा था. वो आप सोचिए 1950s से दे रहा था, जबकि चाइना की इंडिपेंडेंस 1949 में हुई. तो जब से वो इंडिपेंडेंट हुए, जब से न्यू चाइना आया सामने, तब से ये एस्पियोनाज चालू है इन डिफरेंट फॉर्म्स, एंड दे हैव बिल्ट इट ब्रिक बाय ब्रिक. So 1986, you go back to when Soviet Union was the biggest rival for the Western world. China was doing the espionage and doing it under the radar.
Just a quick question about, I know कि UK के अंदर MI6 है, USA के अंदर they've got CIA, right? India में you've got RAW, Pakistan's ISI. What are Chinese spy agencies called? I've never, it's just never come up on anything I've ever read.
So China operates through various means.
They don't have a fixed spy intelligence agency?
They do have a state agency that does the work for them, but it's not spoken about in as clear terms as the CIA and the KGB, and that's why I mentioned about it. So वो उनके, और the way they perform in a very disaggregated fashion, which may seem like you have these छोटे प्यादे pawns going out there, but they collect information, and all of that is part of the entire Chinese warfare, which goes back to their ultimate objective of how do they build this empire. How do they build this empire is by getting inside, like termites, and getting into societies, making people argue for them, making people sit inside, and using corporates, which also has come about. Just to digress a little bit, जो Soviets का क्या था कि Soviet economy was not integrated into the global economy.
Right.
तो उसमें
They've always operated on their own.
Yes. तो आपके जो agency था, वो KGB was pretty much known as a spy agency. यहाँ पे तो आपके global economy के जैसे Soviet Union collapsed after the Berlin Wall, the Soviet communism as we knew it collapsed, and 90s में America became the sole superpower. उस वक्त it was the Western world that got China integrated into the global economy. It is they who are complaining today. They are the ones who actually got China integrated into the global economy. और उसके बाद में China underwent a complete 2-decade phase of consolidation. चाइना ने 2013 के पहले किसी के बारे में कुछ कहा नहीं, वो मैं बाद में बताऊंगा आपको, लेकिन 1992 से लेकर के आपके 2012, 10, 12, 13 तक China was consolidating its image, its economy, its integration with the global economy. Alongside, China was also creating avenues for information collection across the world, which became much more intense after the arrival of Xi Jinping in 2013. और ये आप Huawei को देख लीजिए या various other corporate firms, they were all involved in collecting information. We hear bits and pieces, कभी newspaper में आता है कि वो Chinese cameras हैं, वो सब,
or we hear that there's certain Indian games that are funded by Chinese companies that actually collect Indian data, stuff like that. Yes.
So they have been doing that, and 2014 में there was a big push by Xi Jinping to create the National Technology Fund. तो National Technology Fund के चलते उनका ये था कि you'll have these Chinese companies on the front foot, whether it was Jack Ma, Alibaba, a lot of these TikTok became very well known, but ultimately, and you'll see that in 2019-20 में a lot of these guys disappeared from the scene. Jack Ma and some of these other guys, the tech barons disappeared.
Especially around the time of COVID or...
Yes. And they were deliberately made to disappear because what China realized, what Xi Jinping realized is that, these people had made a lot of money, but the ultimate purpose tha of using these corporate platforms to strengthen their nationalistic goal, वो हुआ नहीं था. और वो एक्सपोज हो गया आपके ताइवान में जब नैन्सी पेलोसी विजिटेड, कि हाँ जी बहुत शोर मचाया कि we'll do this, we'll do that, but they did not have the wherewithal to carry out. So the bark was stronger than the bite, which is what was proved. कि after all you do your espionage, your information collection, you're building up the narrative for what? जो reunification का गोल था उसको वो अभी भी है, लेकिन जो आपने what you had demonstrated that you're going to be really making it difficult for the US to make any sort of a connect with Taiwan, the visit of Nancy Pelosi resulted in China doing all these exercises around the close to the Japanese coast and the Taiwan coast, but they actually Xi Jinping realized that all this that they had done from 2014 to 19, creating this technology fund, had come a cropper, क्योंकि इनका जो collection था वो ये private wealth or private individuals became wealthy, but the nationalistic goal was not served. तो semiconductor के ऊपर जो उनकी जो focus थी वो बन नहीं पाई, और वो अभी जो strategic goals वापस जो Xi Jinping has realigned the strategic goals is to focus on strengthening their domestic semiconductor industry, and again, you go back to stealing the semiconductor. There have been cases of espionage as far as Taiwan is concerned. अब ताइवान से इंजीनियर्स चुराना, इंफॉर्मेशन चुराना, ये इसका गोल यही है कि आपका सेमीकंडक्टर इंडस्ट्री जब तक स्ट्रांग नहीं होता चाइना में, Chinese plans on Taiwan will always remain on the back foot because the semiconductor industry in Taiwan accounts for 92% of the world's semiconductor industry. इसका मतलब ये है कि जो आपके जो फेसबुक है, ऑटोमोबाइल इंडस्ट्री है, गूगल है, टेक इंडस्ट्री है, सारा कुछ डिपेंडेंट होता है सेमीकंडक्टर के ऊपर, और वो सेमीकंडक्टर का पूरा जो दबदबा है वो ताइवान के पास में है, विच इज़ वाई चाइना का रीयूनिफिकेशन गोल जो 2022 का था किसी वक्त, अब वो 2026 में हो गया है, क्योंकि उसके बीच में काफ़ी चीज़ें हैं. ताइवान का इलेक्शन है 2024 में, यूएस का इलेक्शन है, सो इट्स गोइंग टू बी एन इंटरेस्टिंग पीरियड.
I have 3 follow-up questions. तो मैं एक के बाद एक सारे के सारे बताता हूँ. सबसे पहले तो सो आई एम इन बॉस्टन इन 2019 एंड मेरा रूममेट है, उसके पापा डेमोक्रेटिक पार्टी के अंदर कुछ काम करते थे, नॉट एग्जैक्टली फुली एसोसिएटेड नहीं थे बट पैक्स के थ्रू काम करते थे
जी.
तो वो एक फर्म के साथ अलाइन हुआ था जहाँ पे ये लोग चाइना के ऊपर रिसर्च करते थे, खासकर चाइनीज स्पाइंग के ऊपर, राइट, एंड दे वुड ट्राई टू एक्सपोज इट यूजिंग कम्युनिटी रेडियो इन द यूएस. तो and he was an obsessive guy, my friend, right? मेरा जो housemate था, he found himself doing this research, and एक दिन हम लोग पोर्च पे बैठे हुए हैं, he's written a 20-page paper, that was his assignment, उसको submit करना था, and his laptop turned black, एक hacker message आया और वो just the laptop froze forever, right? That's one incident, which is when I started noticing कि maybe the clandestine activities that people talk about in China, maybe they are true. And if they could do it in the US, they can do it anywhere. Number one. Number two, right where you're sitting, the founder of Greater Than Gin came, and he said he went to Burgundy, France to do a master's degree in wine. To his surprise, 80% of the students were Chinese, and their degree in wine in Burgundy, France was subsidized by the government. The government paid to learn this esoteric art. थर्ड जो मुझे चीज़ पूछनी थी कि ऐसा क्यों है कि you look at the Russia-Ukraine war, for instance, Putin believes in this united Russia narrative, right? Where it's like, बस चले तो वो सब कुछ ही ले ले वापस. All these countries that are Eastern European roughly, like he assumes there's a claim that he has on them. Now does Xi Jinping also believe that? कि ताइवान भी मेरा है, हांगकांग भी मेरा है, तिब्बत भी मेरा है, अरुणाचल प्रदेश भी मेरा है. Is there still like a unify like Asia around Chinese identity? Is that narrative also present?
Yeah. So I'll just to answer your question slightly differently. ये एक पुराना चाइनीज़ गोल है और ये गोल चाइना का शुरू होता है 1949 में 1949 when China became a new China, as you call it, because the Communist Party, as we see it, came to power. और जब 1949 में उन्होंने ये तय किया कि 100 साल में China will retain its glory. Now, what glory are we talking about? Chinese believe in legacy and history more than anybody else. You know, their way of looking at all these areas are based on what they think, how history has been in the past, and where China's position has been in that history.
So there is a older glory that they're trying to reinstate?
Yes, older glory that they're talking about in the 15th and 16th centuries. तो उस वक्त क्या था कि जो Vietnam and some of these southeastern states थे और जो Asian states थे वो vassal states थे और वो चाइना के emperor को they used to give them, it's like the tributes and if I may put it this way, it was more like giving them the hafta for their own protection. So एक बार वियतनाम से राजा आए चाइना में. अब he refused कि मैं तो नहीं पे करता जी, I'm not going to be vassal to you. So he was called to Beijing, but the fact is he was not made to meet the emperor, not even the second in line, not even the third in line. वो कहीं fourth in line जो ministers थे उन्होंने उनका स्वागत किया, उन्होंने चाइना में उनको घुमाया. And I'm connecting it to the earlier thing about narrative and perception management. They are very strong with that. So what they did was, this guy, he was taken all around China, he was shown everything, and then he said abhi emperor ka time nahi hai, abhi dusra koi milega, and all that, how they managed the whole thing, so that they built it up in a manner that, look, you are lucky here, we're trying to get that thing with the emperor, the appointment, but the fact remains that you have you've come here and we are looking after you. You'll be looked after very well, but you're not so high in the pecking order, please remember. So वो जो वापस गया, he was finally given an audience with the emperor, but the perception management was such that when he went back with a halo about his impression about the Chinese and what they were. So इनकी जो perception है that, look, at that point of time, the Middle Kingdom was great. Everybody used to pay their tributes. Everybody would be a vassal state around them. तो वो उसको they used to call themselves as to be the center of the earth. And that's what I'm virtually the center of the earth, and the land under the skies under the heavens. So that is the Chinese perception of what China's position is in the world order. Yeah. Now from there, China suffered. China suffered in the 19th century, in the Second World War. Pehle Tibetans were very powerful at that time, and then the Japanese came. Second World War, China was ravaged. China in the 19th and 20th century, China believes that it went through a century of humiliation. तो जब ये माओ जेडोंग और इनकी जो पूरी फौज आई 1949 में 1949-50 में, उनका एक मुद्दा ये था, उनका एक ऑब्जेक्टिव ये था कि टू रिस्टोर चाइनाज पास्ट ग्लोरी, एंड दैट इज़ वेयर इट ऑल बिगिंस फ्रॉम. दैट इज़ वेयर इट ऑल बिगिंस फ्रॉम. एंड टू योर क्वेश्चन, अब वो 1949 से लेकर के 2049 तक ये एम था कि चाइना की ग्लोरीज हम वापस ले आएंगे. और दिस इज द 100-year goal. 100-year goal. But after Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, so ये 100-year goal चलता रहा. 1992 में, 1992, 93, when China was brought into the global economy, integrated into the global economy, there in that phase was consolidation. Their phase was not taking on, it was cooperation. बाद में आया competition, and now it's going to be conflict. So where China emerges in its goal is in its journey right now is that what it emerges in terms of China is that it is in a state of conflict with the larger world because it believes that it has to occupy its central place in the world. 2013 में जब Xi Jinping आए पावर में, उसके बाद जितने स्टैंड ऑफ्स हुए हैं इंडिया के साथ में, 7-8 स्टैंड ऑफ्स हुए हैं, दे हैव बीन, एंड देयर हैज बीन अ लॉन्गेस्ट वन इन गलवान एंड द एंटायर ईस्टर्न लद्दाख. There are more standoffs, many more standoffs in this last 7-8 years period than there have been in the last 4 decades preceding it.
And we're counting like the 2 or 3 big wars, 62,
yes,
67.
Yes, उसके अलावा 67 के बाद में, 67 is when we defeated China in 2 successive battles. उसके बाद में 2013 तक चाइना के साथ में जितनी स्टैंड ऑफ्स हुई हैं, उससे बहुत ज़्यादा स्टैंड ऑफ तो 7 साल में हुई हैं. वो इसलिए क्योंकि चाइना का कंसोलिडेशन फेज खत्म हो गया, जिसकी मैं बात कर रहा था 92 से, जब वो ग्लोबल इकोनॉमी में आया.
wants to expand.
हाँ, और 1950-60s में चाइना का गोल था टू बी अ रीजनल पावर. अब चाइना का गोल है टू बी अ ग्लोबल पावर. तो 1950s में भी देखें तो 1958 was the first time they attacked Taiwan, and which was followed by the 1962 Indo-China War. China was trying to assert itself in the region, saying that, look, we are the most dominant force in the region and we represent the new world order, the new world that is beginning to emerge post the Second World War. I'm just taking now
for sure.
You sort of, if you mirror that to 1990s, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the new world order emerges. China's integrated back into the thing, but China's not strong enough to really force itself, on the others as a rival superpower. Right. So it takes its time, consolidate करता अपने आप को, and then 2013 में when Xi Jinping comes into power, they believe this is the time when he unleashes the Belt and Road, plan.
What is that?
That is the Chinese plan to build a road that connects China with Europe, because China की dependence on because otherwise China is not connected with Europe. So I think that is the one
trying to build the Silk Route again.
Yes. So all of those, lots of those things came into being. China decided that it will build a global blue water navy. 2015 में उन्होंने document निकाला that we are going to strengthen our navy, going to become a superpower navy by 2030. So Xi Jinping has always been focused on building China as a superpower by 2035 or even earlier by 2030, because 2049, who knows, he wouldn't, by all likelihood, he's not going to be there. He wants to prepone the entire journey, and he has become much more sort of aggressive since the time he came to power, and he wants to, and therefore the South China Sea, therefore the reunification of Taiwan, because this was always in the agenda. It's just been hurried, and that's why you see so many things occurring together. China had never let go of its goals. If the world thought that China had forgotten about its journey and its goals, I think they were mistaken. It's just that now they've all come together. China believes कि अभी उनकी जो शक्ति है as a global power, it's come to a stage where they can execute some of their plans. And Arunachal was always, 90,000 square kilometers of Arunachal Pradesh, they have never let go. They've always claimed that. South China Sea, China has always, and China creates its own rules. They would create islands in the ocean, and islands in the ocean वो 9-dash line करके है जो islands बनाई है चाइना ने. अब यूएनओ क्लॉज, यूएन की जो संस्था है जो ओशंस के ऊपर डील करती हैं, उनके गाइडलाइंस के मुताबिक जहाँ पे आपकी लैंड है उसके इर्द गिर्द X 100 nautical miles तक आपके waters होंगे.
So China reclaimed land.
So you build an island on the ocean or on the South China Sea around which you can claim land. When they did that, they were obstructing the Filipino fishermen. उनकी फिशिंग इंडस्ट्री ख़राब कर दी आपने, बिकॉज उनके बोले आप फिलिपिनो बोट्स जो हैं वो आप कैप्चर करने लग गए, saying that look, these are our waters. When it went to the UN, when the dispute went to the UN, it was ruled at Hague. It was ruled in the favor of Philippines, but China said to hell with the international organizations.
No one actually listens to the UN anyway.
Yes. So that is how they've. So in order to understand why China is doing this, it's important to look at the overall narrative. And China की जो dream है वो ये सब चीज़ें जो, whether it's South China Sea, whether it's Tibet, whether it is Arunachal Pradesh, all of this is part of that overall Chinese plan, which they have not veered from. They have become much more aggressive about it.
Yeah. And it's so funny that the smoke and mirrors that you see from China is that they busy you with their narrative, which basically states that, hey, listen, we can produce anything you want.
Right.
Best manufacturer, cheap manufacturer. So as a member of the common citizenry of India or across the world, you're like, China is what cheap goods are made.
Yeah.
And you forget all of these little games that they're playing, espionage se leke, border skirmishes, ye sab वगैरह. I had a question about Xi Jinping, which is, I read your article about how he's kind of trying to recreate this great leap forward, right?
Yeah.
Mao Zedong का फिर वो दोबारा idea लेके आ रहा है. The COVID policy was very weird. I was reading a bunch of articles yesterday which said China is basically 99% confirmed कि हाँ हमारे lab leak से COVID आया था. Right? It's out now. They can no longer hide it. But the policy that they had around COVID, I mean, New Zealand had a pretty weird policy. They have an even weirder policy, and now people are dying in a lot of numbers. Is his policy about COVID, is it a face-saving mechanism? Is it emblematic of this 100-year resolution that you're talking about? And I mean, for the lack of a better structuring for this, who is Xi Jinping? Why is he the instrument for this state? There have been other leaders. Why is he so successful in doing what he does?
Good question. Very good question, Vinamre. If I look at Xi Jinping's rise, Xi Jinping came at a point in history when China was ready. And uske pehle Deng Xiaoping, 1980s में, 1990s में, that was a phase where China was rebuilding itself from the Mao years. But it had not lost sight of the Mao years. It had not lost sight of communism. It learnt its lessons from the collapse of the Soviet Union. So उन्होंने China में एक कहावत है कि bide your time till you actually get the opportunity to strike. So they did that, and they spent the entire time, and then of course you had Hu Jintao and the others like you spoke about. उनका वक्त इस समय था in the global timeline that उस वक्त वो अपना consolidation कर रहे थे. तो शी जिनपिंग जब आए, उनका he is very ambitious. He is very ambitious. If you see as a personality, his father was a political. His father was part of the party, and his father, on account of certain issues, again China में उस वक्त, अभी तो खैर अभी भी है, पर उस वक्त तो अभी भी पता नहीं चलती, पर उस वक्त कुछ ज़्यादा होता था, वेयर उनके फादर को किसी कोई चार्ज लगा करके कि you are probably not adhering to the party norms, and some charge was imposed on him, some espionage charge, and he was sent to the farmlands to work. And Xi Jinping spent a lot of his time growing up there. Xi Jinping ke andar, I mean, that's another thing that is conjectured, that there is a deep-seated sort of anguish and a desire to overturn a lot of the things, given that his father and his family suffered when he was growing up during his childhood, and he spent a lot of time in along with his father, sent to the outskirts. Exiled, and his father was humiliated. तो वो चीज़ें उनके जहन में थी जब वो बड़ा हुआ, and all of those things kind of would have led to, and his ambition is fueled by a lot of the past. And so एक चीज़ ये, दूसरा his timing of his ascension to the premiership, which came at a time when China was ready. And then that ambition was fueled. And if you look at his opposition, they were all taken out one by one. And in the October, the convention in 2022, there's a famous clip of one of the well-known Chinese leaders who was escorted out of the auditorium. So, he has been a personality like that, who has not really brooked or encouraged any difference, not that other Chinese leaders have, but he has dealt any opposition with a much more firmer hand than his predecessors. And that's why you see that COVID ka, the way, I'll give you a few numbers that I recollect, that when 1 million plus had died in the US in 2020, 2021, and about 500,000 plus in India, or close to that, in these democracies, the noisy, cantankerous democracies, यहाँ पे तो सब कोई बोल रहा है कि भाई गवर्नमेंट दोषी है, कोई बोल रहा है गवर्नमेंट ने अच्छा किया. So all of those debates and discussions happened. But whichever side, whatever argument you make, these democracies now, when you look back, they handled COVID better than anybody else. I mean, you look at China, I mean, people were talking about China. China में deaths नहीं हो रही. मेरा एक कहना था उस वक्त कि look, we are sometimes seeing China from a very shallow sort of a standpoint. We need to see China from the prism of its overall narrative, the history, how China has functioned, how the government in Beijing has functioned. वहाँ पे आपको दिखेगा कि कितनी ओपेसिटी रही है. नंबर्स में कभी मैं बिलीव ही नहीं किया चाइना कि जब वो यहाँ पे 1 मिलियन 500,000 लोग हर एक कंट्री में मर रहे थे, चाइना में डेथ टोल था 1,600. अभी बताइए, इन अ कंट्री वेयर ओवर few millions, 10s and 20 million would have been infected, you had deaths of 1,600, and then you had what you call as a vaccine nationalism. And that's why I compare him with Mao, and he's often compared with Mao, and the deaths of 1958 to 62, the famine-related 45 million deaths. Now, when you compare that with what happened here, you'll see the similarity. And you'll see how vaccine nationalism is a modern era mirror of cultural nationalism that was happening in
मेरा वैक्सीन सबसे बढ़िया है.
नहीं, वो तो माओ के टाइम पे था. कल्चरल नेशनलिज्म था, जो कल्चरल रेवोल्यूशन था, जहाँ पे आप you were actually sort of putting people behind bars because this you saw spies and espionage everywhere. You saw people taking information and maligning China. So that was a period of Mao. जब उनके he used his chief spy Kang Sheng and some of these others, and he actually put Deng Xiaoping, who was who was a dissonant voice उस वक्त उनको prison में डाल दिया. Deng Xiaoping के लड़के को उन्होंने Mao's men, I mean, they threw him off the first floor, and he was paralytic for life.
How was Mao able to get away with it? I mean, because at that point in the world, you're past 2 world wars. The world is not as democratic as it today. It's certainly not as transparent, right? We don't have the internet.
Right.
How was he able to preside over 45 million deaths with no one batting an eye? I mean, from what I read, it's like he was trying to build this communist utopia ki jahan pe log communes mein rahenge and everyone's like...
Yeah.
How was he able to get away with that?
Because I think the West's focus was on Europe. Europe had been completely destroyed.
Right.
And the focus was on building Europe. और दूसरा ये था कि एक तो focus यूरोप पे था, दूसरा enemy दूसरा था उस वक्त. Enemy Soviet Union था.
Yeah.
Nobody was interested about China. What was happening somewhere in this part of the world? What was happening here?
It was considered the Far East,
Yes.
not essential to the world political order at all.
Yes, only to the extent US को ये लगता था कि भाई यहाँ पे सोवियत यूनियन का सैटेलाइट स्टेट नहीं बनना चाहिए. तो जब तक वो sort of criteria वो फुलफिल होता था कि यहाँ पर कोई सोवियत यूनियन का सैटेलाइट स्टेट ना बने, तब तक यूएस वाज सैटिस्फाइड. आई मीन nobody really cared, I would put it this way, nobody really cared in terms of how people were dying, what was happening, how China was being governed. It's a fair point you make, and I think that is what was happening then. Now when I say Deng Xiaoping's son was thrown off the first floor and he was a paraplegic for his entire life, interestingly Mao के बाद में Deng Xiaoping आए, and he was the next leader. So now if you look at it's a more modern form where things are televised, तो भी उसको escort करके लेके गए his rival, and he's not been seen after that. We don't know. It's just that there are modern methods to a medieval thought, but the thought, the ways still remain medieval. The narrative still remains one rooted in the past, but in the current era. And some of these things almost mirror the way things are going. I mean, vaccine nationalism is one of the things that we see. और अभी December में जब वो, like you said, now everything has been thrown open, people are dying. December से लेकर के January, एक महीने के अंदर suddenly you had 1.5 million.
I just have a quick question. I don't understand कि vaccine nationalism का मतलब क्या है?
वैक्सीन नेशनलिज्म का मतलब ये है कि हमारा वैक्सीन सबसे अच्छा है, हमारे तौर तरीके सबसे अच्छे हैं, हमारा गवर्नेंस सबसे अच्छा है. And I again reiterate that fact that building a perception, building a narrative. और अभी इनका narrative ये था कि look, our rival superpower has not been able to manage things. But look at us. We are the guys who can actually, which fell apart because जो इन्होंने वैक्सीन बनाई थी वो काम आई नहीं. अब उसमें people started having relapses, people started dying. Today it is said, one of the figures, it says about 65 to 70% of the country was infected around January, February, and you can imagine what those numbers would be. Even if we account for the fact that there are better means of saving people's lives today than what it existed in 2020, फिर भी आप इतना ज़्यादा अभी जो इतने ज़्यादा तादाद में जो लोग इन्फेक्टेड हुए हैं उसमें से even if you discount a percentage, still you'll see about 4 to 5 million deaths, which is what they're expecting. I mean that's what, but you'll not suddenly it's all gone quiet. It's all gone quiet. You will I'm sort of predicting this, that you'll see a few bunch of articles emerging from the West that how China has really rolled back and sort of managed this very well from December, January. That is bound to happen. But are they true? Are they those numbers? 2020 में भी हमने सुना था how China has governed the whole thing very well. It was not. It was just a facade, a smokes and mirrors, which has been used in 1960s in a different way. Today technology is there, तो हमारा उसके बारे में दूसरे तरीके से पढ़ते हैं.
Yeah, it's almost like बाकी सारे जो, and you can have your coffee. I think it's gonna get cool. Do you want more?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
I think, like, for example, other states in the West almost value, to whatever extent they can, showing transparency in national policy, international policy. I think China really enjoys subterfuge and surveillance, and I think they pride themselves on that.
Yes.
I don't know if you probably already know, you've heard about the I Ching, the Chinese book of fortune telling almost.
Yeah.
So
I haven't. Yeah.
So basically, you use about 3 coins and you roll them in your hand like that, like a dice, and then you add up heads and tails, and it comes to a number. Say 6, 60, 17, any number from 1 to I'm forgetting where it ends.
Yeah.
But the interesting part is each chapter is an oracle that comes from an older time in China where kings were confused. So each is a military strategy that can be used in real life. So for example, number 60 is limitation. If you ask a question, it'll give you a military strategy with limitation in the 4, right?
Yeah.
So when you mentioned to bide your time, it's also a part of Chinese philosophy.
Yes.
Like they've got one chapter on why you must wait 10 years before you wage a war, something like that, right?
Yes.
So what I'm trying to understand from this is people generally see China as one-off events that they do internationally, one-off events that are covered in the media, a diplomatic exchange.
Yeah.
But I don't think enough people understand that you have to understand their core philosophy, how they view the world.
Yes.
Because the Chinese view the world very differently. Like individualism is not the norm. It's like even when I had friends, Chinese friends in the States, it was extremely hard for me to speak to them about anything about their state.
Yeah.
They would have interests, we would jive about several popular culture topics. But you could never get them to speak about the state openly. I'm just wondering why that is.
Well, I think, we must also remember that the Chinese Communist Party has been in power for almost, 70, 80 years now? 70 years, yes, dating back from 1949. तो जो वहाँ पे जो एक इंडिविजुअल कॉन्शियसनेस में जो थॉट परवेट की है फॉर जनरेशंस has been one of securing the state, always looking at the state and the others as us and them. And so it's one of the things that, that's become a part of the consciousness. I will also add that, I have met, Chinese individuals who are fine friends, great friends. But I think the fact that, the state is an extension of an individual is deeply embedded in the collective consciousness of Chinese society. And to sort of tear away from that, there are individuals who I know, there are friends who I know who believe differently. Yeah. But the larger section of individuals and their understanding of China comes from a long history of how an individual has been taught to be a part of a state's ideals and an extension of China's beliefs. So I think that is where it stems from in terms of how individuals look at China and how they look at it as a collective set which they must represent at every forum and every place around the world.
It's so fascinating that you say that because when you go to Colombia, for instance, you're like, I'm an Indian abroad studying or partaking in a foreign land. Based on what you said, a Chinese person could be like, I'm a Chinese person abroad and I'm a state actor. Like, it's so funny. Like, as Indians, we don't assume we're state actors when we go abroad, right?
Yeah.
It's like, the Indian state is, unless you're a diplomat or a dignitary.
Yeah. Yes.
But the idea that the citizen is a state actor is just, like, I can't imagine that as an Indian. Like, I'm here to do the Indian state's bidding as someone who's, say, I don't know, a writer.
Yeah.
It's just, so now I want to kind of come to this idea that you brought up about Xi Jinping being sort of bitter about his father's exile and stuff.
Yeah.
Because I noticed parallels with Zulfikar Bhutto.
Yeah.
Which is, now it is time to unveil the book,
Thank
right? Watershed 1967, India's Forgotten Victory over China.
Yeah.
I didn't expect Pakistan to be there, but earlier on, you mentioned that the predecessor of Zulfikar Bhutto happened to be someone who, kind of understood India, like had a similar cultural background, had an understanding of the Indian subcontinent as we know it.
Yeah.
But Zulfikar Bhutto was bitter about India. He had harsh memories of the partition. And just drawing on that theme, is like, at some point it stops being about international policy. It's about one man's vengeance that just gets extrapolated over a nation. So what is the story of Zulfikar Bhutto, Ayub Khan, and then we can go on from there.
So I'll tell you a little story.
Okay.
Junagadh Nawab, the Nawab of Junagadh in 1947 had decided that he will align with Pakistan. And we all know that in 1947, the royal states across India were given the option that, either you have the option of choosing between India and Pakistan, and some of the border states had accordingly made their choices. The states, Kashmir, of course, is a different kettle of fish, and I'm not addressing it here on this question. But let me talk about Junagadh. So Junagadh के जो नवाब थे, he had thrown his lot with Pakistan. However, the local population, and this was what was decided, that the local population will, जहाँ की local population है वो या इंडिया की तरफ आना चाहती है तो इंडिया पे आएगी, और इंडिया की तरफ आएगी, और जो पाकिस्तान की तरफ है वो पाकिस्तान की तरफ जाएगी. So here in Junagadh, the local population wanted to be with India. The Nawab wanted Junagadh to be a part of Pakistan, which didn't quite happen. So one day in Lahore, you had planes arriving, local private planes. What happened was, in Junagadh, the Nawab, he was fond of dogs, so he had lots of dogs, and he got a lot of all his dogs into the aircraft. He boarded the aircraft himself with his family and his Prime Minister's family, and they flew to Lahore. They landed there, and suddenly you find the Nawab of Junagadh in Pakistan. You had the Nawab of Junagadh in Pakistan. They stepped out into Pakistan. He had his family, his dogs, his Prime Minister, and his Prime Minister's family. In his Prime Minister's family was a 10-year-old boy, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. So he had this deep-seated sort of bitterness about having been driven out of India, and always believed that there was something, that an unfinished agenda that he always carried. He had a chip on his shoulder, and that is something that he wanted to fulfill and finish at some point of time, which leads me to Ayub Khan. President Ayub Khan had trained in Sandhurst. He knew the Indian...
Sorry, what is Sandhurst? Is something...
Sandhurst Military Academy in the UK, where many of the Indian and Pakistani officers of that time would train. अभी भी Indian officers do go, select Indian officers do go for training at some point of time in their careers. पर उस वक्त जो है शुरुआत की ट्रेनिंग सैंडर्स में होती थी, और उस ट्रेनिंग के बाद में प्रेसिडेंट अयूब खान, वहाँ पे प्रेसिडेंट अयूब खान एंड जनरल चौधरी, the Indian Army chief in the 1960s. So, you had many of these Indian Army officers and some of these Pakistani Army officers who had trained together. So, they had known each other personally. 1965 is sometimes known as a gentleman's war because, people knew each other on both sides. And I write about it as well, how the Pakistanis responded. But, कुछ चीज़ें गलत थी पाकिस्तान के perception में. They thought they were fighting the Hindus, which is what President Ayub thought. And President Ayub, I'll just step back. President Ayub's initial response was not to take on India at that time, because Pakistan was developing very well as a nation by itself. It was the original Asian tiger in terms of its economic growth. Pre-1965, Pakistan had grown very well under President Ayub Khan. And whereas India was struggling, India had a defeat in 1962, setback against the Chinese. Jawaharlal Nehru had passed away in 1963-64, and you had a new Prime Minister in Lal Bahadur Shastri who nobody knew about. कि करेंगे क्या ये, मतलब इनकी पहचान उतनी नहीं थी, and देन 1965 वॉर में उन्होंने अपनी पहचान बनाई. लेकिन उस वक्त इंडिया की जो स्थिति थी वो पाकिस्तान के मुकाबले उतनी अच्छी नहीं थी इन टर्म्स ऑफ इकॉनमी, इन टर्म्स ऑफ वेयर पाकिस्तान एंड इंडिया स्टूड देयर इकॉनमीज. पाकिस्तान वॉज द राइजिंग एशियन टाइगर, द ओरिजिनल वन. अब वो पाकिस्तान की हालत उस वक्त, बट it was still a very militarized state. When I say that, it had a forsaken democracy to choose a military leader, Ayub Khan, who had done well, but at the same time, he was also somebody who believed that this is a state that he would run by his own military means. वो अलग था. But 1962 के बाद में ये perception बना कि India has become weak. And India does not have the appetite, the wherewithal to really oppose a thrust, a war. तो यहाँ पे Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's idea or his ambition, his desire became more intense. He wanted to take revenge for what had happened to him. The fact that he had been thrown out of the country, or he had left the country. He believed that, this is something that he would fulfill through, by firing from the shoulders of President Ayub Khan. 1965 का वॉर जब हुआ तब वो उस वक्त ये था कि they knew that China, they had by then they had made friends with China. I'll also mention something which has not been talked about very often. 1959 में अयूब खान और चाइनीज़ के बीच में, पाकिस्तान और चाइनीज़ के बीच में there was a dispute, which Ayub and the Chinese were not, being able to resolve for a while. Ayub Khan, on his way back to Pakistan, stopped over in Delhi to see if India and Pakistan could come together against China. But his message, or his, India rebuffed his message because his message was also laden with a lot of other complicated desires, which was Kashmir.
Right.
तो वो था. But Ayub Khan initially, so this goes back to 1959 where, Ayub and the Chinese didn't see eye to eye. But then 1962 war happened, and then Pakistan saw that as an opportunity to extend its hand, its friendship hand with China, instead of India, which it had briefly tried to do so in 1959-60. तो 62 में वो हुआ. 62 के बाद में, if you look at the period from 62 to 65, Pakistan spent a larger amount of its defense budget in terms of arming itself, getting weapons from the US, tanks from the US, as well as aircrafts, and also creating a larger reserve of manpower, which it had done so with an objective of taking on India at some point of time. 1965 में it thought that it was the right time to do that, to carry out that offensive. And in that context, and I've written about it in the book, and we started the discussion with espionage, it was again built on the platform of espionage. And CIA was very strong here. CIA का दबदबा काफ़ी था. तो उस वक्त CIA के एजेंट्स यहाँ पे दिल्ली में और आपके Kalimpong was called a nest of spies by Nehru. वहाँ पे KGB, CIA.
Where was Kalimpong?
Kalimpong is in West Bengal. Okay. And वहाँ पे बहुत सारे, you had the daughter of Stalin, or daughter of Lenin, one of the leaders, and you also had the Prince of Denmark who was living there. You also had Devika Rani's husband, Svetoslav Rorich, was a painter. Devika Rani was a Bollywood Hindi film heroine, very well known. And you also had KGB officials, you had CIA. It's a very interesting spot, which was doubling up as a nest of spies. तो Kalimpong अपनी जगह था. वहाँ पे काफ़ी चीज़ें. There was a market जहाँ पे secrets used to be traded, कि आज कितने का भाव बिक रहा है. तो वो सब Kalimpong में होता था. दिल्ली में भी CIA काफ़ी हद तक मौजूद था. And they were tracking the movements of a Kashmiri politician, which is where the book starts.
Sheikh Abdullah, right?
Sheikh Abdullah. और शेख अब्दुल्ला 1964 में या 1965 के शुरू में, he had met Shao Enlai at Algiers at a summit. और वो वहाँ पे उन्होंने शाओन लाल ने बताया था कि देखो हमारा प्लान ये है कि Sikkim was not a part of India, it was a protectorate. India is to look after its defense and finance.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying that around this time, despite ki sari princely states dissolve ho chuki, India is one nation now, Sikkim still had unique status?
Yes, Sikkim still had unique status. Sikkim was a protectorate, and China had its eyes on Sikkim. China had its eyes on Sikkim because if you look at it, Sikkim, to begin with, did not have a border with China. It had a border with Tibet. और वो जब चाइनीज़ फोर्सेस तिब्बत में आई 1950 में, तब सडनली द सिक्किम में जो हमारी फ़ौज थी, द डिफेंस वाज इंडियाज़ बंदोबस्त, तो सडनली दे फाउंड देमसेल्व्स ऑपोजिट द चाइनीज़ आर्मी, द PLA, in 1950, because the Chinese forces arrived in Tibet. And what had happened was the Sikkim, तो ये 1964-65 में जब शॉवन लाई ने उनको बताया कि भाई हमें आपकी सपोर्ट चाहिए इसके अंदर. Apparently Sheikh Abdullah had given him support that okay, the plan was this way, that Pakistani forces will arrive in Kashmir and will infiltrate and into the population and will instigate a revolt inside Kashmir, followed by the classical military attack. जो पहला वाला था, it was called Operation Gibraltar.
I was going to say that, yeah.
हाँ, और दूसरा वाला था Operation Grand Slam. Grand Slam से मतलब once you soften up the underbelly by getting inside, infiltrating and inciting the population to revolt. The second one, जो दूसरा था, वो ग्रैंड स्लैम था जिसमें आपके टैंक्स वगैरह मिलिट्री फौज रोल इन हो जाती है और जम्मू और अखनूर को बाकी के कश्मीर के साथ में कट ऑफ कर दे. अखनूर और जम्मू को कैप्चर करके कश्मीर को बाकी कंट्री के साथ से अलग कर देता. दैट वाज द प्लान. और दूसरा उसका ये था, पहलू ये था कि चाइनीज़ फोर्सेस विल अराइव इन सिक्किम विच वाज अ प्रोटेक्टोरेट एंड ऑक्यूपाई गैंगटॉक. इसके बाद इनका ये प्लान था, बड़ा ख़तरनाक प्लान था. इट्स वेरी डेंजरस प्लान, इग्नोर्ड फॉर मैनी ईयर्स. Why they did that? Ignored in the sense, ignored in our history, which is what I found, that the plan was to get India to the negotiating table after having captured Kashmir here in the north and Sikkim in the east, and force India to the negotiating table wherein Kashmir would be wrested back, would be given away by India to Pakistan, which was always the aim, and the other in exchange for the exit of the Chinese from Gangtok.
Whoa, so they were colluding all this while कि मैं यहाँ से attack करता हूँ तो वहाँ से कर, and then we will just take off territory from them.
Yes, and also make India deploy at two different places, which would have made it very difficult for India to fight two fronts.
Yeah.
आज हम two front war की बात करते हैं, वो तब सोच रहे थे तभी. And also the idea was to come into Sikkim, occupy that, because India didn't have the kind of wherewithal to take on the Chinese. That was what was assumed. और वो तभी होता जब पाकिस्तानी फोर्सेस अंदर आ चुकी होती कश्मीर के.
Right.
And get India to agree to and the other thing was, the aim was to also completely decimate India's sort of image, humiliate completely, so that India उससे कभी उभर के आ नहीं पाता अगर ये होता तो. So it was a very dangerous plan.
Who foiled it, or did it not happen due to logistical reasons?
So several things happened. One is I would talk about the role of leadership. When I say leadership, the leadership had changed at several levels. 1962 के बाद में, 1962 was a very feeble leadership at the political level, at the military level. The military leadership did not have the spine to stand up to the political leadership and tell them that what you're saying is wrong. That is moral courage, which they lacked in 1962.
And who's they? India, China or Pakistan?
1962 in the war between India and China. तो उस वक्त जब इंडिया की प्रिपरेशंस थी, काफ़ी हिस्ट्री है कि इंडिया में 1959 में एक एक्सरसाइज लॉन्च की गई थी, ऑपरेशन लाल किला, जिसमें बताया गया था कि इंडिया डज नॉट हैव द नेसेसरी मीन्स एंड इक्विपमेंट टू टेक ऑन चाइना. और नहीं है बिकॉज द बजट्स नहीं है, बिकॉज आपने एलोकेट नहीं किए, बिकॉज आपने इक्विपमेंट नहीं मंगवाया, एंड पीपल वर इन द हिमालयाज इन एक्सट्रीम कोल्ड टेम्परेचर्स and in very poor equipment, very poor clothing, or you won't believe the kind of clothing that they were given to fight in sub-zero temperatures was absolutely inhuman. So our leaders lost the war, not the soldiers. Wherever they stood and fought in those sub-zero temperatures in fragile clothing, they really stopped the Chinese. They gave them a good fight. लेकिन वो 62 में हुआ. 62 में जो हुआ वो that was because of the ineffective political leadership, the lack of military leadership which could really take a decisive stand on some of these follies that the political leadership was committing. तो वो 1962 की लड़ाई में वो हमारे को लेसन मिला. जो लेसन मिला वो ये था कि we have to really stand up and fight, take on wherever there is this thing, and also give military the autonomy to take its decisions, to take its command decisions, take its operational decisions. 62 में क्या था? Krishna Menon was the defense minister. He wanted to run everything, which is where he had little understanding of how the Chinese were prepared, little understanding of military preparations. 1959 की रिपोर्ट में लिखा गया था और उनको दिया गया था रिपोर्ट, जनरल थोराट ने बनाई थी. वो रिपोर्ट प्राइम मिनिस्टर नेहरू तक पहुंची ही नहीं, और उसमें बताया गया था कि इंडिया इज़ नॉट वेल प्रिपेयर्ड टू टेक ऑन चाइना. 1963 में जब कृष्णा मेनन रिज़ाइन उन्होंने किया तो पंडित नेहरू ने जनरल थोराट तब रिटायर हो चुके थे, उनको बुलाया गया. उनको कहा कि ये रिपोर्ट आपने लिखी थी 1959-60 में, दैट इंडिया इज़ नॉट प्रिपेयर्ड to go to war with China, and yet we did. But I have not seen the report. General Thorat told him, this question, Mr. Prime Minister, you should be asking your former defense minister. That was the kind of moral courage which military leaders had, who were ignored in 1962. So now I'm talking about the transformative change that happened. Right. तो 1962 के बाद में जो change आया, you had a new defense minister, Y.B. Chavan. You had a new army chief, Jain Chaudhary. You had General Harbaksh, who was the army commander during the 1965 war. General Sagat was in 17 Mountain Div in Sikkim. So he was a brigade commander first, and then he went on to command the division in Sikkim, the Black Cat division. So you had the right military leaders in the right places. And then 1965 happened. Everyone thought that Lal Bahadur Shastri wouldn't take a decision. He probably didn't have the appetite to take an aggressive decision. That was the moment of inflection when India launched a counter-strike into Pakistan, and Indian forces went very close to Lahore and went close to Sialkot. And that is what foiled the प्लान ऑफ पाकिस्तान एंड चाइना. इनका पार्ट 1 ये था कि अगर पाकिस्तान कश्मीर के अंदर आ जाता है एंड ये जो अंदर आकर के इन्वेट कर लेता है, देन चाइनीज़ विल नॉक ऑन द डोर्स ऑफ सिक्किम एंड चाइनीज़ विल कम इन एंड ऑक्यूपाई सिक्किम. लेकिन ये पहला प्लान इसलिए नहीं हुआ बिकॉज यू हैड अ डिसाइसिव प्राइम मिनिस्टर इन लाल बहादुर शास्त्री. यू हैड जनरल हरबख्श who was an outstanding general who led the war, and the overall जो fighting है, जो operational command decisions है, वो फौज को लेने दीजिए आप. Political decisions must always be the overarching decisions, but जो tactical decisions हैं, जो command decisions हैं, वो फौज ने उस वक्त ली. And I think 1965 was an inflection point because my book starts with that part. Right. And one of the things that got unnoticed, that went unnoticed, was the fact that Chinese were also knocking on the doors of Sikkim in 1965. That was the other inflection point. We stood up against the Chinese, and here General Sagat's role comes into play. And a decision that he took in 1965 is actually one of the most underrated decisions in history, which saved the balkanization of India.
The balkanization of India?
The separation of the northeastern states of India with the mainland of India. It was a decision that General Sagat took in 1965, which I would think it is underrated because it has not been recognized as much.
Right. And what was for the viewers, what is exactly the decision that he took?
Yes. So, let's also understand कि अभी हम 2023 में बैठे हैं. 1965 में जो हमारा जो साइकोलॉजिकल जो स्ट्रक्चर था और साइकोलॉजिकल मेकअप था चाइना के प्रति, वो काफ़ी हम अंडर प्रेशर आ जाते थे क्योंकि 1962 में वी हैड लॉस्ट मेनी lives, and there was it was a war which we were not prepared for. The political leadership and the military leadership, neither of them. तो वो सब था और what then happened was 1965 के वॉर के पहले, इंडिया पाकिस्तान वॉर के पहले एक मीटिंग बुलाई गई of the three divisions, the 20 mountain div, 27 div in Kalimpong, and the 17 div in Sikkim. So these are the divisions in Sikkim and in North Bengal, which are responsible for the border with China in that area. तो वो जब मीटिंग बुलाई गई 33 कोर हेडक्वार्टर, जो इनकी जो हेडक्वार्टर है, इनके बॉस जो लेफ्टिनेंट जनरल कोर कमांडर थे उस वक्त, उन्होंने मीटिंग बुलाई. तो वहाँ पर अग्री किया गया 1965 की युद्ध के पहले कि जब चाइनीज़ फोर्सेस ज़्यादा प्रेशर डालें तो हम जो बॉर्डर आउटपोस्ट हैं, नाथुला में एक बॉर्डर आउटपोस्ट था और जेलेपला में एक बॉर्डर आउटपोस्ट था, तो यहाँ से हम पीछे आ जाएंगे. पीछे किस लिए आएंगे? पीछे आकर के हम अपनी जो हमारी रियर में जो हमारे फोर्सेस हैं उनके साथ में मिल करके we'll consolidate the rear and we'll fight them through consolidated effort, and we will not thin out in front. Rather than that, we'll come back, we'll withdraw from there.
So that means that they will almost let them march in further.
Yes.
And then you will have a thick army prepared.
That was because, the idea was not to escalate. The basic issue was not to escalate the tensions with China, because हमारी लड़ाई जो है वेस्टर्न फ्रंट पे चल रही थी. तो हमारा सोच उस वक्त ये था, it was guided by that as well, that look, we don't want to escalate issues with China, and therefore if there is pressure on the Sikkim front, we'll try and not escalate it. And if there is pressure, we'll pull back forces from the border outpost. बॉर्डर आउटपोस्ट में क्या होता है कि आपकी एक कंपनी जिसमें आपकी 100-125 लोग होंगे अक्रॉस डिफरेंट, और इवन सम प्लेस लाइक नाथुला जहाँ पे आपके इवन लेस प्लाटून प्लस तादाद में लोग थे. एंड इवन देयर इज दिस अदर बॉर्डर आउटपोस्ट कॉल्ड जेलेपला. ये जो दो बॉर्डर आउटपोस्ट थी इसमें कम लोग थे, एंड दे वर लिविंग इन they held these border outposts which were directly facing China. Now when the Chinese pressure was applied in 1965, because I said that there was Chinese pressure from the other side to stretch India and to see where Pakistan is going in Kashmir, and if Pakistan was really making inroads, यहाँ पे ये लोग अपनी अग्रेशन का जो प्लान था वो यहाँ पे उसको दे वुड हैव ब्रॉट इट इनटू प्ले. लेकिन ये हुआ नहीं. तो अब वो जब प्रेशर अप्लाई कर रहे थे तो हमारी जो पुराने प्लान के मुताबिक जो हमारी जेलेपला जो पोस्ट थी, जेलेपला और नाथुला जो दो बॉर्डर आउट पोस्ट थे, उस जेलेपला की जो पोस्ट थी वहाँ से लोग वापस आ गए हमारे, और वहाँ पे चाइना आके बैठ गया, और आज भी चाइना वहाँ बैठा हुआ है.
Really?
Yes. But the fact is, I must put it into context as well, that though they have occupied the pass, उसके जो आजू बाजू जो heights हैं वहाँ पे जाकर के हम बैठ गए हैं. So we dominate.
But they still have the post.
They have the pass. La is a pass.
Okay.
La translates for a pass in the local language. तो जेलेपला में चाइनीज़ फोर्सेस उस पास पे हैं, बट जो उसकी जो आजू बाजू की जो हाइट्स हैं उसमें इंडियन फोर्सेस हैव gone and sat there, which has meant that they can't move because they are dominated by India.
Yeah.
So that is the context of it. लेकिन I must add this, that they gained a psychological ascendancy by occupying it. कि हमने बोला कि आप घर छोड़ करके चले जाइए, आप घर छोड़ के चले गए, बट आप उस छत पे बैठे हैं. मैंने तो घर ले लिया है, but the fact is I can't do anything. You also can't do anything. But the fact is, I have done what I intended to. I have gained a psychological ascendancy by occupying something that I threatened you with.
I've also redrawn my borders.
Yes. Now. So you have, and you have also occupied places around it, and by dominating the lower ground, you can always not let me move. But the fact is, I can also say that, yes, I've pushed you back.
Yeah.
तो ये हुआ वहाँ पे जेलेपला में. So the reason why I started with Jelepla is I want to come to Nathula. Nathula में General Sagat decided not to move. he was faced with, and this is where the leadership, when I talk about leadership and the change from 1962 had happened here. कि 1962 में जो हमारी, I'll not go into the details of 62, but जो जहाँ पे हमने positions ली थी नामकाचू रिवर के पास में, वहाँ पर जो हमारे GOC थे, जनरल Call, who ran the war, who was very powerful at that time, but he had no understanding of the ground situation. He railroaded the local commanders, but the local commanders couldn't raise their voice. They were not able to take a stand. वो हमारी, it was a lack of professional, sort of competence, or या तो more than that, lack of courage, lack of spine, the inability to stand up to higher commanders, which showed up in 1962. 1967 में जनरल सगत के ऊपर काफ़ी दबाव डाला गया, क्योंकि भाई आप ये प्रोटोकॉल था और ये हमारा, we had decided that you will fall back. He did not listen to his own commanders. He defied the Chinese because he believed he had known the land very well. And if the Chinese came and sat at Nathula, then they would dominate Sikkim, they would dominate Gangtok. They could roll down and dominate the Indo-Gangetic plains. They could also come down and dominate, and when I said, they could cut off the northeastern states, I'm coming to that. So, if you occupy Nathula, they could have come down, taken Sikkim, and cut India out. Cut the mainland of India out from its northeastern states, because you come down from Sikkim to the Siliguri corridor, and if you take your mind back to the Indian map of India, उसमें आप देखेंगे कि नॉर्थ बंगाल का जो आकार है, जोग्राफिकल आकार, वो इस तरीके से है कि जो नॉर्थ में आप देखते हैं वो एक पतली सी गली आती है, and then it comes to the northeast side. Yes, so it's called the chicken's neck. हाँ, तो वो चिकन्स नेक जो है बड़ा वल्नरेबल हुआ करता था. एंड लेट्स रिमेंबर, वी आर नॉट टॉकिंग अबाउट बांग्लादेश, वी टॉकिंग अबाउट ईस्ट पाकिस्तान, बिकॉज उस वक्त बांग्लादेश नहीं था. बांग्लादेश इज अ फ्रेंडलियर कंट्री टू इंडिया टुडे, है ना. बट दोज डेज इट वॉज ईस्ट पाकिस्तान, दोज ईयर्स इट वॉज ईस्ट पाकिस्तान. सो ऑल इट नीडेड फॉर चाइना वॉज टू कट इंडिया आउट फ्रॉम इट्स नॉर्थ ईस्ट बाई टेकिंग its forces through the 20-kilometer wide Siliguri corridor, which would have ended India's resistance or weakened India's resistance, because India's northeastern part would have been segregated from its mainland.
That's a very strategic part of the country. They would they would also have like an ethnic argument to make that, you know.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yes.
So if this has not happened, if General Sagat did not do what he did, we could have lost the northeast.
And I'll come to why this was important, because history showed up his decision as something most significant, but one of the most underrated decisions that has almost gone unappreciated. Of course, General Sagat is appreciated for all the valor and all the great deeds in battlefield in 1971 and 1967, Nathula Chola, I have written about it, and also the liberation of Goa in 1961. वो सब है, but ये जो decision था उनका 1965 में to stay put and not move from Nathula, defying the enemy, the adversary, defying his own superiors and commanders, because it's a classical decision dilemma, and we all face it in our lives. And I talk about it in many talks and lectures, that look, it is relevant today. Courage comes in two forms: physical courage and moral courage. What he showed was moral courage. And decision dilemma, because when you talk about taking a decision, you're always faced with two options. यहाँ पर भी उनके पास दो ऑप्शन थी. ऑप्शन ये था कि प्रोटोकॉल कहता है कि हमने जो डिसाइड की हैं उसी पे चलना चाहिए, और दूसरा ये है कि नहीं, मैं बिलीव करता हूँ कि यहाँ पे रहना चाहिए. How do you decide? So he decided what was impacting the higher call. The higher call is not about, obeying the superior's decisions or what we have agreed to and all of that. The higher call was of defending the territorial integrity of the country he had resolved to fight for. it is that one line. It is that one line why a Fauji goes to the border and why you have the various, you have an Indian army which is so very well decorated. And you saw Kargil where so many officers, young officers died. I'm just digressing a little bit, but so many young officers died leading their troops. You will not have any other army in the world where so many young officers have led their troops in very difficult situations. This is what defines it. The resolve to protect the territorial integrity of the country is the overarching narrative, which is what the leaders decide. And of course, that's why the Paltans, and you fight for your Paltan's izzat. You fight for your Paltan if you're if you're an officer or a Jawan of Punjab battalion, Punjab regiment, or a Gorkha regiment, or a Mahar or a Maratha. They swear by their Paltans, their regiments. And the overarching thing is, of course, why are we doing this? Because we have resolved to fight for the territorial integrity of the country. And so that was the highest call. And so he decided what would be better protected, which decision, which outcome, which option would be better, which will better serve the higher call, which is of protecting the territorial integrity of the country. And there he took the call of defying his own superiors, which is very difficult. We can always talk about it in theory, but in our daily lives as well, it becomes very difficult to sort of justify, and you will face a lot of criticism when you're going against the grain of a classical sort of narrative.
And in something like the military, where hierarchies essentially decide your fate, because there are serious penalties to breaking chain of command, right? Like you could potentially risk people's lives. And if disorder becomes the norm, then it's like the seeds of rebellion have been sowed in something that should be ideally very uniform and regimented.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. It's like General Sagat was made of very different metal, and in the army, though, yes, of course, we talk about regimentation, and we talk about having uniformed sort of understanding of an approach to a battle or an operation. But those who stand out are the ones who have defied the predictable norms. And throughout history, you look at Napoleon, you look at military commanders all across, if everybody had done the same thing, then, how would you have the victorious ones separated from the ones who were not victorious, and though equally gallant? So General Sagat's career is, if you look at his career, every time he has done what he thought was the right thing to do on ground. He read a war very well. And when he read a war very well, he believed that this was the way to go forward, which he did in 1971 as well, which was again, when he crossed the river Meghna and made his march and did his march towards Dhaka. His bosses were not really expecting him to do so. But then he did what he did. The outcome was that, he was the one who led his forces into Dhaka. And that was 1971. Just to step back and talk about the previous part of, you said, well, the chicken's neck would have been threatened. तो 1971 में जब ये लड़ाई छिड़ गई इंडिया और पाकिस्तान के बीच में, तब चाइना पे काफ़ी प्रेशर आया निक्सन और किसिंजर का, और उन्होंने बोला कि भाई आप लोग इंडिया पे प्रेशर डालिए. बट द फैक्ट इज they were reimagining the India-China equation from 1962, जब इंडिया इंडिया had suffered setbacks. तो उस वक्त की जो इमेजिनेशन थी वो निक्सन और किसिंजर के पास मौजूद थी, और निक्सन और किसिंजर को एक किताब दी गई थी 1970 में निक्सन की विज़िट के टाइम में टू चाइना. एक किताब नेविल मैक्सवेल ने लिखी थी 1962 के युद्ध के बारे में. तो उनका जो इम्प्रेशन था कि इंडिया डर जाएगा, चाइना प्रेशर डालेगा, वो जो 1971 में उनका जो इम्प्रेशन था, जो अमेरिकन 33,000 फीट नॉट अप बट अवे, or 33,000 square miles away impression, where you are not really in touch with what is happening between the two countries on ground. तो उन्होंने काफ़ी प्रेशर डाला चाइना के ऊपर, लेकिन चाइना ने अपने फोर्सेस मूव नहीं किए. अब वो उसके कई कारण हैं. वो इंदिरा गांधी ने ट्रीटी साइन करी सोवियट्स के साथ पे, सोवियत फोर्सेस आ गए चाइनीज़ बॉर्डर में, तो चाइनीज़ couldn't extricate their forces. There was also an underrated reason, and that was the fact that 1967 में नाथुला और चोला में दो लगातार पराजय के बाद में चाइनीज़ साइकोलॉजिकल डोमिनेशन जो इंडिया के ऊपर थी वो ख़त्म हो गई थी. चाइना डिड नॉट बिलीव दैट दे कुड overrun India anymore. China did not believe that they could defeat India anymore. They had this belief before 1965, 67, but not after the two successive defeats. Now, what that does, कि 65 में अगर वो हट जाते पीछे, तो 67 का जो नथुला का युद्ध तो होना ही नहीं था फिर. 65 में अगर सगत सिंह पीछे हट जाते, जनरल सागत, अगर विद द चाइनीज प्रेशर, तो वो होना ही नहीं था. फिर तो चाइनीज बैठ जाते नथुला में, एंड वी वुडंट हैव बीन राइटिंग और टॉकिंग अबाउट द बुक एनी मोर. तो द अदर थिंग दैट वुड हैव हैपेंड इज it would have exposed the Siliguri corridor in 1971 as close to 67 as 1971, which is like just 4 years or 5 years. 65 में इन्होंने decision लिया. 6 years after that, India and Pakistan were at war on the eastern front, and US was pressurizing China to put pressure on India, move its forces so that India is, India holds back. India is not able to mount its offensive in the war, because the US at that time, Nixon and Kissinger, were against India and were supporting China, but China wouldn't move an inch. China didn't move any forces, and which was interesting. And that is why it goes back to the events of 1967. That is why it goes back, the aspect of history goes back to the decision of General Sagat in 1965. अगर उन्होंने वो नहीं किया होता तो 71 में Chinese forces could have come and cut off India's northeastern part with its mainland, and the outcome of the war may have been different. History would have been written very differently. So history is a narrative that is built along several data points, and it is important to understand why somebody took a decision at certain points in time to arrive at the final outcome. 71 का जो युद्ध था, yes, the Indian forces went into Bangladesh, East Pakistan, won on 16th of December, Pakistan surrendered. But उसके पीछे कुछ reasons थी. 67 is important. Yeah. 65 is also important. And General Sagat is one person who's involved in all of this. 67 as well as 1971.
Yeah. You want to drink some water?
No, yes, I will. Thank you.
No, I didn't mean that as a sarcasm, because you've been speaking a lot. So
yeah. No, it's a topic that's close to my heart. And,
I love how well read and how passionate you are about this. So people don't know this about you, but you've been a company commander.
Yeah.
The Gorkha rifles, 11 rifles?
511 Gorkha rifles.
511 Gorkha rifles, right?
Yeah.
So there's this old trope that I've seen a lot where ऐसा होता है कि बहुत सारे people who serve in the armed forces often criticize leaders because they make decisions without having any skin in the game. Right? Or like they will often send you to war without knowing कि ground reality क्या है.
Yeah.
But so you have done your degree in international relations at Columbia.
Yeah.
And you've also served.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you've seen both worlds.
Yeah.
You've led your life as an army man, and you now have strategic interests and geopolitical interests like this. Out of sheer curiosity, during your training as a Gorkha, especially because the opening sentence in italics in the book is this Gorkha Devi Prasad slashing people through a kukri. Kukri. Dagger jo hota hai. I found that very strange. I've almost never read an account jahan pe you're not using a gun, but you're just sort of going into territory and just slashing people. So, let's both of us step back in your days of training and deployment. What was specific about training as a Gorkha, and maybe where does this specific practice or this specific weaponry style come from?
So the two things here. When you serve, so Gorkha rifles consists of, you have Gurkhas from Nepal and India who join the regiment, and then officers who get commissioned. Officers get commissioned into different regiments. They could be Gurkhas, they could be Marathas, and but जो इनके regiments में जो Maratha regiment है वो जो recruits draw करती हैं, soldiers they come from a particular region, and that is why उनका नाम जो है regiments के नाम उस तरीके से दिए गए हैं. And so you have a Madras regiment which has a lot of people from who join as soldiers, as you know. So but the officers are commissioned from IMA, the Indian Military Academy, or the Officers Training Academy. यहाँ से उनका जो NDA से आते हैं officers, and then they come to IMA. So ये कुल मिला करके यहाँ से officers, then officers after the completion of their commission, they join these regiments. अभी क्या होता है, when you are with your infantry units, in my case it was Gorkha rifles, तो आपको your understanding of the ground, the people who you are with, you people who you command, you come very close to them in terms of you speak their language, you understand them much better. And I'll tell you in the context of this 1967 battle as well. तो ये सारी चीज़ें मिला करके क्या होता है कि you are able to command your company या platoon या battalion when you get to become a battalion commander, as a commanding officer. All of this is a journey wherein you have to be one with the troops. You have to do what they do, and you have to win the confidence and the trust of the people who you command.
Hearts and minds.
Yes, and you basically, because you're doing everything that they do when you're in the field. That's how you win the hearts and minds. You win their trust, you win their confidence, and that is how you command at different levels, at various levels as you go along. And which is one of the biggest learnings in the forge. When you come out, and you are in the corporate and you do several other things in your lives. One of the things that stands out is the trust, is the camaraderie, and that is built by staying with them, doing the things that they do, and also, and I spoke a bit about Kargil. So Indian Army is unique that way. Kargil में जितने young officers की डेथ हुई हैं, वो किसी भी आर्मी की किसी भी बैटल्स में शायद ही हुई होंगी. वो इसलिए क्योंकि इंडियन आर्मी ऑफिसर ऑलवेज इज ऑन द ग्राउंड लीडिंग हिज ट्रूप्स फ्रॉम द फ्रंट in any of these operations that you see. Kashmir, in the valley, you will always read about the officers leading an operation.
Right.
So it's ingrained in the ethos, in the functioning of the Indian Army, that an officer, always leads from the front, is with the troops. And एक और बात ये हो जाती है कि when we talk about and I spoke about it in the opening chapter, the religion of the troops is your religion. And because I mean there are different, you have Muslim troops in Grenadiers, you have Gurkhas, to religions जो जहाँ की आती है, the region, whatever, they become the officer becomes one with the religion of the troops.
You take the cultural identity of your men.
You take the culture, exactly. You do that. So that is something that happens. You spoke about Devi Prasad Limbu, and so what that means is you're able to identify the strengths and the capabilities of your men much better than you would if you were, not close to them, or you are not living with them. You're actually in the mountains, you are living with your troops, and you know what they're doing, you know whose strength is what, you know who's uske family mein kya chal raha hai, usko kya dikkat hai, and usko kab ghar jana hai, कब घर से आया है.
You can't say मैं प्रोबल हूँ, मैं मुंबई में रहता हूँ, यहाँ पे तो ऐसे ही होता है. Like you can't have that distance that I'm this commander and you live your lives, and
far away from that, far away from even thinking about that. You are, you have to know your troops very well in order to command them well. So in the case of Devi Prasad that I wrote about, he was this young 20-year-old Gorkha soldier from Nepal, and he used to be working in the officers, the officers mess, jahan pe he used to be a part of that. Someone identified him, one of the officers who knew of him, identified him as somebody who would be an asset if he were to be taken out of the officers mess, and if he was part of one of the company locations, which was right in the front. So he was sent there, and because his energy, his enthusiasm, his drive was something that was recognized by one of the officers. And Devi Prasad Limbu, and you asked me about the kukri. Kukri is a traditional weapon that is used by the Gorkhas. And वो जो गोरखा यूनिट थी, जो 11GR की यूनिट थी, जो वहाँ पे चोला में गई थी, it was a replacement for one of the Jacriff battalions, जम्मू कश्मीर राइफल्स की वहाँ पे उनका लोकेशन था. वो वहाँ से नीचे आए हुए थे किसी कारणवश, और ये टेम्परेरीली गोरखा की जो 11GR की जो यूनिट थी वो वहाँ पे गई थी. तो उनके पास में उतने सारी एम्यूनिशन उस वक्त नहीं था. तो दैट्स वाई व्हेन द आर्ग्यूमेंट ensued and Devi Prasad Limbu just waded into the Chinese, lopping off heads left, right and center, and that also actually drove a deep sense of fear amongst the Chinese. Normally क्या होता है कि आप देखेंगे कि दूसरे कहीं पे नाथुला में भी Chinese opened up first, और दूसरे जगह में Chinese take the initiative.
I'm so sorry, can I stop you for 1 second? इतार please AC off कर दे थोड़ी देर. AC off कर दो. हाँ, थोड़ी देर के लिए बस. Just give me the remote, I'll do it. Sorry, I'm just freezing here. No.
I know the.
Yeah, right, no stress. Yeah, so you were saying.
So Chola
normally what happens?
Normally we have seen in history, even अभी with तवांग के पास में वो Yangtze में हुआ था. Chinese soldiers had come and they wanted to alter the boundary. तो China does not do anything कि अच्छा आज मन किया हम लोग कल ऐसे करते हैं. It's part of the larger plan. So जब नाथुला में इनकी पराजय हुई तो इनकी तमन्ना ये थी कि भाई इन्होंने सोचा कि भाई ये फ्लैश इन द पैन है, ये तो हो गया इनसे, पता नहीं नाथुला में कैसे जीत गए, अभी हम चोला में इनको हड़काते हैं. So they started an argument in Chola. But the different thing in Chola, as opposed to the other India-China skirmishes and battles and other things, is that they were started by China. Here, the argument ensued and the initiative was taken by India, by Devi Prasad Limbu.
So the argument means कि troops आपस में बहस कर रहे थे.
बहस कर रहे थे.
This was not sanctioned off by leaders. You go attack.
No, it was not. It was not from our side. It was an initiative taken locally by Devi Prasad Limbu. However, इन चीज़ों में क्या होता है कि you had the Nathula battle which had taken place about a fortnight before that. So the troops on Indian side were also prepared कि कुछ हो सकता है, तो let's be prepared and let's not give the Chinese any inch on the ground or any psychological advantage. और हमने gain की है नाथुला में. तो वो preparations तो थी. अभी आप देखेंगे कि चोला में हमारे 11GR की जो बटालियन थी उनकी preparations भी काफ़ी तगड़ी थी. They had prepared that look, it may seem like a very instinctive, which it was, but जब instinctive एक्शन भी होता है जैसे देवी प्रसाद लिंबू का था, तो उसके पीछे प्रिपरेशन बहुत ज़रूरी है. अदरवाइज यू लुक लाइक अ फूल कि मतलब ये क्या हो गया.
राइट, हॉट हेडेड, इम्पल्सिव.
यस. सो दैट इज नॉट नेवर द केस. What usually happens is when you see an instinctive action taking place, it is also backed up by deep-seated preparations. In this case, I'll come to what preparations. So Devi Prasad Limbu had wrested the psychological dominance or momentum away from China in that less than 1 minute or less than 1.5 minute of action that he mounted on China, which dented the Chinese confidence. And that's why it starts with that. And then it goes back, the story. But Devi Prasad Limbu was this young boy from Nepal who had grown up listening to or hearing about these great martial stories of various Gorkha soldiers, Ganju Lama, who won a Victoria Cross in the 1940s, 1942 में when he blew up 7 German tanks. So ऐसी stories पे ये बड़े हुए थे, and they were very brave, courageous, ferocious. the Chinese were very scared of them. And lo and behold, when the Chinese took on a bunch of Gorkhas at Chola, they suffered because Devi Prasad Limbu opened up with his kukri, and the Chinese thought कि उनके पास में हथियार है, पर हथियार कोई काम नहीं आया. जब ये क्लोज क्वार्टर कॉम्बैट जो हम कहते हैं, उसके अंदर देवी प्रसाद लिम्बू ने अपना कुकड़ी निकाला. Because the Chinese
How big is the kukri? How can you behead someone? It's not a katana sword, right?
Oh yes, you can behead. Yes, it is.
Just a dagger.
It is a longish dagger.
Okay, it's a longish dagger.
Yes, it is a curved longish dagger.
Okay.
Which is something. Yes, it is. Katana is bigger, but this is something that is more. You can wield it with much more
dexterity.
Dexterity and much more agility. So that is what he did. I must also say that that argument was initiated by China, or somebody had fired a bullet which had hit an Indian soldier,
right?
Which is where Devi Prasad, sort of mounted an aggressive challenge.
And then he was martyred.
He was martyred. He was martyred when his body was given back. The Chinese officer told the Indian officer, "Who was this man who fought like such a brave warrior? And who is he?" So that was the kind of खौफ. उस तरीके का खौफ इन्होंने चाइनीज़ रैंक्स में शुरू में ही डाल दिया था, और उसके बाद में उससे उभरना थोड़ा मुश्किल हुआ. लेकिन चाइनीज़ जो है, दे फॉट बैक वेरी वेल. दे फॉट बैक वेरी वेल. It's just that no territory was won or lost. There is an argument that emerges that Nathula Chola में कोई territory win या कि victory या लॉस नहीं हुई, ना चाइनीज़ साइड में ना इंडियन साइड में. लेकिन उससे भी बड़ी एक चीज़ हमको मिली, वो थी एक साइकोलॉजिकल डोमिनेशन. मोमेंटम चेंज हो गया इंडिया चाइना के की जो जर्नी थी. हमारी जर्नी 7 में स्टार्ट हुई थी. 1947 में हम आज़ाद हुए, 1949 में न्यू चाइना का फॉर्मेशन हुआ. लेकिन 1967 तक, 1966-67 तक चाइनीज़ डोमिनेशन था, वो इंडिया ने ख़त्म किया 1900 ये नथुला चोला के बैटल्स में. और चोला में ही, आई जस्ट ऐड दिस, द चोला के बैटल में चाइनीज़ वर ऑल्सो, as I said, Chinese had brought in firepower. They had their MMG, MMG is a medium machine gun, which was really showering a barrage of hellfire on India at that time at Chola. लेकिन चोला में कुछ महीने पहले जब सीओ साहब, उनके जो कमांडिंग ऑफिसर साहब थे, उन्होंने तय किया कि हम एक बंदे को भेजेंगे मऊ में. मऊ इज़ वेयर द ट्रेनिंग इज़ डन. वेपन्स, एक नया वेपन आया है, रिकॉयलेस गन. तो RCL गन का जो
रिकॉयलेस गन है वो जो पीछे से हिट नहीं करती.
So this is, but you can have a larger area. It's called the area weapon, so because it can destroy so ये जो मीडियम मशीन गन चाइना की थी, तो इंडिया ने अगर रिकॉयलेस RCL गन उस वक्त नहीं लगाया होता, तो that would have proved very difficult for India in terms of the Chola battle. तो क्या हुआ था, तो talking about preparation, तो उसके 6-8 महीने पहले एक वहाँ पे हवलदार तिनजोंग लामा करके थे, उनको भेजा था मऊ में वो सीखने के लिए. तो जब मऊ में वो गए, तिनजोंग लामा पढ़े लिखे नहीं थे उस वक्त. ही मस्ट हैव स्टडीड टिल द 5th और 6th स्टैंडर्ड. सो थियोरी में तो फेल हो गए मऊ में. लेकिन उनके इंस्ट्रक्टर ने बोला कि तुम थियोरी में फेल हो गए, लेकिन योर यूज़ ऑफ द वेपन इज़ सुपर, फर्स्ट क्लास. यू विल बी रियली बी एबल टू यूज़ इट. मतलब आपकी जो तरीका है आपको यूज़ करने का, इस वेपन को जो आपका जो यूज़ करने का तरीका है ऑन द फील्ड इन ऑपरेशन, दैट इज़ वेरी गुड. सो जब वो वापस गए, वही जो उनकी सिखलाई थी वो काम आई. और चोला के बैटल को चेंज करने में ख़ास जो क्रेडिट जाता है वो तिनजोंग लामा को जाता है, क्योंकि तिनजोंग लामा ने उसका आकार बदल दिया. बैटल चल रही थी, रीड इन द बुक एज वेल, एंड ही ब्रॉट इन his RCL, and which took out the Chinese medium machine gun, which was
took out the machine gunner or the machine dismantled the machine gun.
The bunker. I mean,
okay.
The gunner, the gun, everything. So, which then ceased to be of any kind of effect or have any kind of effect on the battle. So, ये जो preparation है, वो important है. और उस वक्त any skirmish or battle may look like an instant action, but it is backed up by thorough preparation and planning, which had happened in the months leading up to it.
Probably I have a question about returning dead bodies, because it just came up and I saw कि किताब के अंदर भी कई बार लिखा हुआ था. अब considering that Devi Prasad Limpu he severed some Chinese heads, तो war time में ये क्या ethics होते हैं कि आज का war खत्म, फिर हम commanders हैं चाइना और इंडिया के, हम आके मिल रहे हैं and then bodies exchange कर रहे हैं, like why does it never go to perpetual war? Why does this body exchange happen?
तो उस वक्त जो
I mean in the larger context as well.
So yeah, I mean, you know, you look at Kargil, you look at as far as 67, since we are on that subject, तो उस वक्त जब वो जो दो battles थे वो ख़त्म हुई और body, क्योंकि China had said that, you know, look, अगर आप, because Chola, even Nathula, India had really gained the advantage. China said, you know, अभी अगर आप बंद नहीं करेंगे तो हम Air Force को use करेंगे. तो, you know, then China said, you know, China was the one which raised the white flag for peace.
Okay.
And after that, after the battles had ended, this is a regular norm to exchange the bodies of the dead, because they are soldiers who have been fighting for their respective countries. Or this is something that is also a practice from time immemorial. And yes, of course, you can always quote wars and battles and, you know, countries that do not follow that. And I will take your mind back to Kargil, jab Pakistan refused to accept its own dead bodies.
Why?
Bilkul, because Pakistan, I mean, we are looking at it from a prism of India, which really has that ethos. And I'm not saying that because I'm an Indian, but Indian Army has preserved that ethos and has always treated the enemy soldiers who have passed away fighting for their countries with the respect a soldier deserves. It has happened in the past with Pakistan in 1965 and other times where, you know, there have been the odd occasion when the Indian soldier was not given the kind of respect it should have been given. But on occasions during those wars, the Pakistanis did give respect to the Indian dead as well. पर ये practices अलग हो गई हैं. There are so many things, you know, there are Indian officers and soldiers in Pakistani prison from which 54 or 55 जो कहते हैं, I mean, those are the ones who have disappeared, who have not been returned by Pakistan, and they are again a blotch on how a nation behaves with soldiers of the other side. But that apart, to your question, this is a practice that takes place at the end, or should, at the end of the war, where we exchange dead bodies, and which happened at that time as well. In 1971, when the war happened, India returned 93,000 Pakistani prisoners who were captured by India. Now there are questions that, you know, why did India return? Yes, because these are again, I must say that, you know, these are as per the Geneva Agreement norms, that soldiers, the how to treat prisoners, how to treat the dead, they're all been defined. And so if you ask me for an institutional framework, that's the institutional framework. If you ask me कि practice ऐसी होती क्यों है, ये soldierly practice norms हैं, ये from time immemorial, they've happened. There have been violations as well, but the Indian Army and the Indian government, whichever government has been over the ages, has adhered to that. And in 1967 as well, those that practice was adhered to by both India and China.
A couple more things before we wrap up. So one thing I sent you in themes was just the technical advantages that maybe the People's Liberation Army of China has over the Indian Army, and vice versa. if we do a historical comparison, 67, 62 के आसपास क्या था, और उसके बाद से अब, because I sometimes will do like these world elite units की rankings में ऐसे पढ़ता रहता हूँ. I'm not sure how credible they are, right? And the Marcos come pretty high, and Navy SEALs वगैरह भी होते हैं. I don't see any PLA people particularly on that, right?
Right.
So my question is, hypothetically, if you place the two armies together, and just the armies, you can let go of the Air Force and the naval forces and subterfuge and surveillance, because वहाँ पे China की strength है. Simply like on ground soldiers. From that standpoint, like where do you think we're placed as opposed to PLA?
See, I don't go by those rankings. I think that's a very, it does not
very
work.
Pedestrian, it's very amateurish, I know. That's
it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way on the ground. However, let me, sort of state it in the context of history. कि 67 or 71 में, 62 में, the Chinese forces were better prepared. They had come off the Korean War of 1953. तो जो soldiers थे उस वक्त, वो काफ़ी experienced थे. उनका जो तजुर्बा था वो काफ़ी इमीडिएट था. 1953 की जो कोरियन वॉर थी वो उसमें विजयी हुए थे. आई मीन दे हैड अ गुड दे हैड गॉट अ गुड रन. उसके पहले 1949 तक उन्होंने सिविल वॉर लड़ी थी. तो बड़े हार्डन्ड लोग थे 1962 के वॉर के टाइम में. I must also add that the Indian soldiers were also coming off the Second World War, where they had fought in different parts of the world. The difference, the soldiers आपके हर जगह मोस्टली अच्छे मिलेंगे. वो that is a saying. It is the officers that make a difference. What happened, there's the leadership that makes a difference. And then that's why I go back to the senior leadership military. I'm not talking about the company commanders and the battalion commanders of 1962. I'm talking about the senior military leadership who were the generals of that time. I'm talking about the political leadership of that time, which was weak, which is what made the difference. 67 में आते हैं. 67 में, again, you had a General Sagat. You see, the difference was there for all of us to see. 65 में जब India and Pakistan took on each other over a war, General Harbaksh, again, a fabulous army commander who was not there in 1962. So there are army generals and politicians who were not there in 1962 who make their appearances in 65, 67, 71, which made a difference in the wars. And I go back to your point of this soldier-to-soldier comparison. Now, that's why I said 53 में जो Chinese लड़े थे वो उनका जो तजुर्बा था वो 62 में काम आया. अब Chinese उसके बाद में China fought a war in 1979 वियतनाम के साथ में. अब उसमें चाइना ने वियतनाम के साथ में लड़ाई तो लड़ी, लेकिन सेटबैक्स काफ़ी फेस करना पड़ा उनको. वियतनाम इवेंचुअली stalled the Chinese advance. Vietnam inflicted defeat on China.
And because Vietnam was in a perpetual war with the US, so they had learned from the best.
Yes. So it all goes back to how much experience, how hardy you are, how hardened you are on ground, how much of experience that you have faced. And I'm coming to why I'm saying this. Because it builds up this, I mean, it's not theoretical. It is all a function of how much time you have spent in various kinds of operations, which makes you a hardened soldier. और 1979 में चाइनीज़ की जो फ़ौज थी, चाइना की फ़ौज थी, उसमें काफ़ी पर्जेस हुए थे जनरल्स में. 1967-69 माओ ने कल्चरल रेवोल्यूशन के तहत काफ़ी जनरल्स को फ़ौज से निकाल दिया था, काफ़ी अपने खुद के लेके आए. तो वो सब चीज़ें भी हुई थी. और चाइना की एक पराजय 1969 में हुई थी, जो मैंने बुक में लिखा है, अगेंस्ट द सोवियट्स. सो चाइना हैड lost to India in 67. Then it again went into a bickering argument.
So it kept losing till 79.
69 में भी हुआ था. तो वहाँ पर भी ये उसूरी की लड़ाई जो है, on the banks of Usuri, the Chinese had suffered a blow against the then Soviet Union. तो अब माओ का ये कहना था कि भाई आप हमें हथियारों से हरा सकते हो, लेकिन हमारे लोग आपके कैपिटल में पहुंच जाएंगे, मॉस्को में. दैट वाज अ वेरी नाइव सॉर्ट ऑफ, ही बिलीव्ड इन दैट पीपल कैन फ्लड द सिटी ऑफ मॉस्को, वी हैव सो मेनी पीपल. But that was a very naive way of thinking, or maybe it was a psychological ploy. But whatever that may be, what happened was by 1979, the defeat over Vietnam rankled China so much that uske baad mein China has over the years changed its approach from a direct adventurist approach, if I may call it, which if you look at the Russians, Georgia, Crimea, Ukraine, adventurist approach. China का adventurist approach था 1962 में, 1967 में, 1969 में, 1979 में. All these, whether it is with India or with the Soviets briefly, and then with Vietnam in 79, वो उस वक्त हुआ करता था. लेकिन वियतनाम की पराजय के बाद में चाइना हैज़ रीफ्रेम्ड इट्स अप्रोच, और उसके तहत क्या हुआ है कि पॉस्चरिंग, वॉर मॉन्गरिंग, पॉस्चरिंग, नैरेटिव, सबटरफ्यूज पे ज़्यादा ध्यान दिया है. नाउ what, therefore, I'll answer your question now, that the Chinese soldier does not have the kind of experience over the last 40 years that the Indian army has had because of its exposure to various insurgencies, whether it's Kashmir or the Northeast, the wars, 71, the Siachen war, battle of 1980s with Pakistan, the Kargil War of 1999, and so on and so forth. So the Indian soldier and also had different kinds of exposures, whether it is insurgencies or countering terrorism, militancy, classical wars. तो हर एक किस्म के युद्ध में उन्होंने माहिरत हासिल करी है. तो अभी उसके मुकाबले you have the Chinese army soldiers who have not had, I mean, this generation is very different from, you won't have the 62 के soldiers there still serving, right? So those guys are gone. अभी जो फौज है उसमें उनमें जो है वो तजुर्बा नहीं है जो पहले था.
They haven't seen any wars.
They haven't seen any wars. However, I must say that, they have also integrated the technology part, the other things, much very well over the years. They've spent, China is a huge country with a huge defense budget, and they have also built up a big navy. They've got their rocket forces, there's missiles, all of that is there, and therefore it's a Chinese force which is a combination of technology and human beings. Indian army is very much, and we have infrastructure now, you have technology, but it's a very human focused force where local battles में आप देखेंगे, even 62 में जो local battles थी, जो मेजर शैतान सिंह की बहुत very famous.
He's called Shaitan Singh.
He was called Shaitan Singh, and he's one of our greatest heroes ever. So that's a separate story. But जो local battles थी, वो वहाँ पर Indian commanders, Indian soldiers, they have always emerged victorious. The reason is that, as I said earlier, in India, the Indian Army, the company commanders, the battalion commanders, they are always leading from the front. The young 21-year-old officers, the 40-year-old or 36-year-old colonels, everybody is leading their forces and they're on ground. And that is why you see the local battles fought much better by the Indian Army. And it is Nathula and Chola are great examples of that. And you see that. हाल ही में जो Chinese forces had come to Yangtze, near Tawang, and they wanted to change the border का आकार जो है वो चेंज करना चाहते थे. 300-400 लोग 300 या 500 सोल्जर्स के बीच में तादाद थी उनकी वहाँ पे आने वाले थे और आए थे, and they were beaten back by India locally, because the local ability and the ability to beat back a local transgression is far better, and that is again a great sort of reflection of how prepared our soldiers are, given the experience, given the fact that he's a hardened soldier. And but yes, the wars are not decided by the tough soldiers on ground alone. They are decided by so many other things, by in today's world, by technology, by the largest strategic maneuvers. But एक चीज़ है कि the Indian Army soldier is somebody who gives as good as he gets, or even better. I mean, that's something that has always stood out, and that will always stand out in future. जो on ground soldier है, वो man to man, it's the greatest, it's the best army that you can get on a battlefield, because of the kind of camaraderie, because of the kind of the hardened capabilities he brings to the table, brings to the battleground. and over the years that has been honed by his exposure to various kinds of different operating environments.
I just have one question.
Yes.
You are a thorough scholar of this and not an armchair scholar because you've actually served. So you retired around what year?
2003.
2003?
Yes.
And then you switched over to helping firms with...
Yeah.
I saw a bunch of words I couldn't understand, so I figured I'd ask. I was checking out your LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Strategic risk management, something of that nature.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you help them do that with your years of experience on the field?
Right.
Then also understanding international relations,
Right.
studying abroad.
Yeah.
How does all of this experience translate to then helping like the next generation of companies or corporates?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things, one of the underpinning word that I have always followed is one has to constantly reinvent oneself. And when I came out of the forge, one of the thoughts I had was to reinvent myself in the light of a changing environment, in the light of a different world that I was in. However, the idea was also to retain some of the core values, the core understanding, and the core approach that one would take to a complex issue. So after I came out, I've been in the corporate for a long time, heading companies, advising them as they come in and invest in developing markets. तो जो मैंने आपको थोड़ी देर पहले बताया था कि किस तरीके से जनरल सगत सिंह took a decision based on what is a decision dilemma and how does he take a call. तो जब आप रिस्क में लोगों को एडवाइस कर रहे हो कंपनीज़ को, तो आपकी जो कोर अंडरस्टैंडिंग है वो फौज की जो बैटल्स है एज एन हिस्टोरियन, यू ड्रॉ अपॉन सम ऑफ दीज थिंग्स. दे आर लेसन्स दैट यू कैन implement across different working environments. In a business environment, when जब कंपनीज आती हैं, निवेश करती हैं और वो देखते हैं कि ये हमारे रिस्क्स हैं, ये हमारा अपसाइड है ऑफ द इन्वेस्टमेंट, ये हमारा डाउन साइड है, तो ऑपरेटिंग इन an environment, fauji environment, helps me understand that look, a problem is a problem till you find a solution. And a solution is found when you are able to see the impact of certain decisions, and you're able to declassify or disentangle a complex knot far more easily. Companies आती हैं, डेवलपिंग मार्केट्स में क्या होता है कि कई जगह you have किसका पैसा आ रहा है, कौन इन्वेस्ट कर रहा है, am I at risk by going into this sector in India? That is one form. Understanding who am I doing the JV with.
What's JV?
The joint venture
Okay.
that you would come in and do. So, corporates have different lingos, different descriptions and classifications, but the core values, core understanding of decision making remains very similar, which you carry forward. You reinvent how you want to approach something, but your understanding of it stems from some of these core values, core understanding of how decisions are made. So when I moved from one to the other, the idea was also to see in terms of when I look at it tactically, in tactical senses, it's advising companies जो यहाँ पे आती हैं, invest कर रहे हैं, Indian companies बाहर जाती हैं.
They don't understand the lay of the land. They're not sure what kind of local problems they might face, for instance, right?
Yeah, and business issues, with a local joint venture partner. कि कितना ट्रांसपेरेंसी है, उनका पैसा कहीं सेफ़ है कि अनसेफ है, इन टर्म्स ऑफ किसी पॉलिटिशियन की फंडिंग हो गई है जॉइंट वेंचर में एंड इट्स गोइंग टू चेंज देयर दिस थिंग, और रेपुटेशन उनकी ख़राब होने वाली है. सो रेपुटेशन फॉर्म्स वन ऑफ द कोर cornerstones of the advisory, where you're advising firms today. In today's world, people are ready to suffer loss. I mean, not ready, but they can live with losses, but they can't live with the loss of reputation. So that is one. So reputation, managing the reputation, helping them understand what impact a decision will have on the reputation of a company is important. That is one of the things that we do. Second thing is, after investment, frauds hoti hai, and we see all the, we read about the various kinds of frauds that are committed across the corporate environment. So we address those as well. So usme, how has the money disappeared? Who has conflict of interest kaise ho gaya? Kahan pe, paisa lekar ke, borrow kiya bank se, lenders se, and then where has the money disappeared? we've had very interesting stories where the money has been taken out, invested in, football clubs in England, or yes, there was a case where, the money was used. That's one thing. And then, you find you look at reputation of firm, you see that, that firm one of the firms had been, where my client was investing, that firm had been using Muammar Gaddafi's money to fund elections in France.
What?
For and using it via an offshore channel, जहाँ पे आपने paintings बेची हैं, वो paintings को माध्यम बना करके फंड को आप घुमा करके फ्रांस में लेके आए हो, and you funded the election campaign of one of the French prime ministers. And so that is one. And of course, people have engaged in different kinds of very large scale transgressions. ये तो बड़ी चीजें हैं. We read about Nirav Modi, we read about some of these people. What we also work on, this is the other side, working on some of these aspects where you read about, like I said, you read about the headline makers, but there are so many other people who have borrowed money and who have not returned, who've gone ahead and taken the money out of the country. So a lot of the work that we do is to identify the assets where the money has been placed, what has happened, how do you retrieve the money, what happens. And these are the people use innovative methods to do that, to beat the system, because the system is slow in terms of catching up. So yes, those, and of course helping firms enter new markets, advising them on various issues of business and the risks that they might face. So it's an interesting journey, and alongside is my interest in strategic international relations and history. So, but they may seem in silos, but they're not. When I understand why China is doing what it is doing, I can also connect it to certain corporate investment or certain kind of a business,
right?
And history helps me position it in terms of the context, or contextualize it in terms of, say, for instance, we're talking about Africa, investment in Africa. You talking about a certain country. If you are a historian, or if you go back in history, you'll see how the US and the USSR drove the arms race in Africa. One company which we were advising in one of the African states, we realized that they were being opposed by a Chinese company, which was if I didn't understand China well, I wouldn't have known that that Chinese company was basically state funded, and how they were basically trying to get the African dictator in their pockets so that they could fund his entire. That's what China does. That's a separate topic, and China has been doing that in Nepal. China has been doing that in Sri Lanka. China has been trying to do that in other countries where they fund the local dictator, and they're able to get all the local projects, infrastructure projects, vagara.
Right, get tenures for their own firms to come and do stuff there.
Yes, but these Chinese firms may look like private firms, but they're state-funded firms. It is something that China does. I call it surrogate warfare with India, which is what you can borrow some of these things into the corporate, and understanding of some of the phenomena in corporate is also informed by what we see happening in the international affairs arena. Today, larger political moves are not separate from one of the business side of things that's happening. Whether you talk about, and they're all intermixed, whether we're talking about the vaccine nationalism, or we're talking about Chinese companies going elsewhere, or we're talking about the supply chain issues in China. So they're not segregated. So it's important to I believe so, that it's important to understand the international affairs dynamics to figure out how business is moving, what's happening, and why certain decisions are being taken.
I just have one more curatorial question for you.
Sure.
And you may please drink your water. I feel like...
No, that's fine. Yeah. Go on.
It seems to me that you borrow from a lot of different diverse fields and then bring them all together as a kind of generalist, which really helps with the kind of nuance you've brought to the conversation today. I've been just blown away. Specifically, maybe like a small reading list or a bunch of publications or journals that you read
Right.
that allow you to be simultaneously informed of both geopolitical issues, international issues, but then also business developments. Like if you, a ballpark of like 5, 6, 7 journals, books that you read frequently that allow you to sort of mine this information.
Yeah. So as far as contemporary issues are concerned, I may agree or I may disagree with some of their articles or some of their issues, but it's important to read some of these, like foreign affairs, for instance. They talk about international affairs, the strategic issues, what's happening with G20, what's happening with some of China's plans or the American.
What is the publication called?
Foreign Affairs.
Foreign Affairs.
So Foreign Affairs is one. Economist is one we all know about. So there are several ones, and there are Indian ones as well. There's Foreign Affairs, there's Foreign Policy. There is. I spoke about Economist. There is Time. So some of these are well-known ones. Then there are ones that are more regional. South China Post is one, which is again helps you understand the region. There are several other ones that exist. I mean, there are tons of them. But it also today what has happened is, and Diplomat is again one there. I mean, there's several ones that are there. There's if you want to there are ones people interested in military history, or there are ones for them as well. There is a Long Wars journal which talks about these insurgencies and
Long Wars journal.
Yeah, Long Wars journal. So there are several publications that you can look for, and what tends to happen is, First Post also does a lot of work around the strategic issues in and around India, as well as global issues. In India, you have First Post, you have Print, and all of these cover several issues. So yes, there are these regular ones that and Harvard Business Review is one that I often read for some of the business practices. They may not necessarily include international affairs issues, but for business practices, that's a very good one to rely on. So it's a combination of several things. I think just keeps me busy.
Yeah, awesome. I think I have to replace my reel and shorts consumption and just start with these because...
So one of the things I want to add is, history is again one of the an area which I'm deeply interested in, and I have seen we spoke about the Indian Army and the Indian soldier. So the next book which I'm working on is one that talks about the journey from 1912 to 2008 in terms of, there are 10 stories, but these are stories from the First World War, the Second World War, post-independence, and the modern conflicts. They describe or reflect on the human drama that involve battlefields and wars and involve the Indian soldier. So you'll see how the traditions, the ethos, the understanding of battlefields and the kind of evolution has happened. And it's a journey. It's a journey through these stories. 1914 में जब ये पहला वर्ल्ड वॉर हुआ था, तब वो इंडियन सोल्जर बाहर जाता था, फ्रांस में जाता था, जर्मनी में वो लड़ रहा था इंग्लैंड के लिए, फ्रांस में लड़ रहा था इंग्लैंड के लिए जर्मनी के खिलाफ.
So fighting someone else's war completely. और वो जब वो कुछ इंडियन सोल्जर्स जब इंजर्ड हो गए तो फ्रेंच हॉस्पिटल में लेके गए, तो उनकी डायरीज में लिखा गया है कि ये तो बड़े अच्छे लोग हैं, वाइट लोग, हमको तो लगता था बड़े बुरे लोग हैं इंडिया में. सो बिकॉज दे वर ऑल्सो डिस्कवरिंग द वर्ल्ड. इट वॉज कॉल्ड द एक्सपीडिशनरी फोर्स. इट वॉज कॉल्ड द एक्सपीडिशनरी फोर्स. और उस वक्त वो फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर में they were discovering the world in their own ways. They landed up in French hospitals and they would say, these guys are nice people. We thought the whites were bad, but they don't speak English. They're French. And that's how they started to know. I mean, there are stories of how Indian soldiers, some of them lived on. And there were children
of the lost children of war. It is called. They called. There are children who were born, and the Indian fathers who were there after the First World War. They stayed and then they came back to India, and there were women who took a liking for the Indian soldiers, and so that happened. So it's a journey, and then you have the Second World War, where again fighting another country's war, and the British and the Allies wouldn't have won many battles if they hadn't had Indian soldiers in their ranks.
That's insane.
That is how they have won the war. And it's unfortunate that Hollywood does not reflect on it as much. And Hollywood does not show Indian soldiers who have fought in different battles across the world. And for the Allies, that is a kind of a bias that
When does this come out?
This comes out later this year.
Okay. I'm excited to have you on when that comes out as well.
Thank you.
Because it's with the way this book starts, it puts you in the heart of the adventure. And I think some scholarship becomes dry when it's not filled with human stories.
Yeah.
And the stories of Indian soldiers across decades as battlefields change, who you're fighting for changes will be very interesting.
Yeah.
I just want to say, Probal, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on today. And like I said, you are so nuanced and so interested in the things that you do that this whole conversation is embodiment of all your interests. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for the time, and it was wonderful having a chat with you. And I appreciate the questions. I think it helped me dig deep, and hopefully it was interesting. And thank you for having me on the show.
Awesome. And people can check out your book, buy it on Amazon, Juggernaut, whatever, right? Even your own website. You've got a nice website. I saw it. Watershed 1967, India's Forgotten Victory over China. People can follow you on LinkedIn. There's another Probal Dasgupta who's an Esperanto scholar.
Yes. He's
a friend?
No, I don't know him, but we know that the other one exists.
Both exist.
Yes, because some of the Twitter posts have been wrongly, he's been wrongly tagged, and so he's kind of. So that's how we linked. We kind of touched.
You both do work abroad. That is for sure.
Yes, so he's much more senior. He's a professor. He's in the academia.
Yeah.
So there's another link that I have. It's iProbal on Twitter. So yes, that's my Twitter link.
Awesome. So this was Probal Dasgupta, and this was Dostcast. See you all next Tuesday or Friday. जब भी अगला Dostcast आता है, subscribe करना मत भूलना. Bye bye. Take care.